We got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling down. I've heard about your hero, Joshua, but his accomplishments are not so great, because there's none like Thomas Jefferson and the wall between church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling down. Some say that the wall between church and state is just a bad metaphor. But if unbelievers can't be protected from the rest, then what is the Bill of Rights for? We got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling down. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling down. Oh, we got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling. Or the wall will come a-tumbling down.
Welcome everyone to today's event, Make America Constitutional Again, Religious Freedom on the Ballot. That was Battle of Church and State by Dan Barker, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It always brings a smile to my face, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it as well. My name is Sarah Levin, and I am the program director of Secular Democrats of America. Secular Democrats of America is a network of Democrats advocating for inclusion of the non-religious and mobilizing to protect our secular democracy. We promote respect and inclusion of non-religious Americans and mobilize non-religious voters. We support and empower our members with the resources, training, and support network they need to make an impact. You can join us and donate to support our work on seculardems.org. I want to take a moment to talk about why we're here and how we got here today. 1 in 4 Americans today are religiously unaffiliated, and this is the fastest growing religious demographic in the country. This demographic reflects the diversity of the nation, but when it comes to age, a huge portion of it is young. 1 in 3 millennials are religiously unaffiliated, and despite the misconceptions otherwise, they are not becoming more religious as they get older. Now, I understand that the term religiously unaffiliated, non-religious, secular can be a bit confusing, so I want to shed some light on what we're talking about here. When I say secular to describe myself or talk about the secular community, it describes the broader demographic of non-religious Americans. However, when I describe secular in the context of governance, I'm talking about the separation of church and state. Anyone who supports that constitutional principle, whether of faith or not of faith, is a secularist. We know that religiously unaffiliated, what I also call the non-religious as shorthand, includes a very broad spectrum of beliefs. About 1/3 of the unaffiliated say they don't believe in God, while the other 2/3 include folks who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, and also includes believers who are not affiliated with a denomination. What all of them have in common is shared values and a shared concern about the issues on the ballot this November. 72% of this demographic support a legal right to abortion. 82% of this demographic support same-sex marriage. 73% say immigrants make American society stronger. 74% say that demographic shifts that will make the United States a majority non-white nation by 2045 is a positive thing. And 72% oppose preventing refugees from entering the United States. The big picture is that the religiously unaffiliated as a demographic are united on the issues. We have shared values, and we have the potential to be a formidable voting bloc. I want to make clear that this is a dedicated space for non-theistic Democrats, atheists, agnostics, humanists, ethical culture, free thinkers, skeptics, humanistic Jews, all non-theistic identities. This is a space for you to organize and be your authentic whole selves, to claim your space within the Democratic Party and advocate to eliminate the stigma of being non-religious and to dismantle the barriers, both politically and culturally, that are preventing us from being proportionately represented in government. This is also a space for our partners of faith who are willing to stand by our side to advocate for our inclusion and to fight for the secular character of our government. If you are a person of faith who is deeply passionate about defending the constitutional separation of church and state, defending pluralism, and protecting religious freedom for people of all faiths and none, you are welcome here. In fact, we need you here because it will take the partnership of progressive non-religious Democrats and progressive Democrats of faith to build the kind of inclusive interfaith movement we need to reclaim religious freedom from the GOP, which has weaponized it and perverted it to discriminate and undermine our constitutional principles. So that's why we're here. And I want to tell you very briefly how we got here so that our next speakers can tell you a little bit more about where this movement is heading. In 2016, when I was with the Secular Coalition for America, some volunteers I was working with in Texas on church-state separation issues, but who also happened to be active in the Texas Democratic Party, asked me if there was something they could do to give non-religious folks a voice at their upcoming convention. So we got to work and we drafted 6 planks, also known as resolutions, on a variety of secularist issues. 3 of them were incorporated into the Texas Democratic Party platform that year, including a call to remove the religious test for office that is still on the books in the Texas state constitution. While it is not enforceable, it is an important symbol of the de facto religious test that non-religious candidates continue to face when they run for office. This new secular caucus in Texas inspired the creation of a secular caucus in Nebraska, which is officially recognized within the Nebraska Democratic Party. Last year at the DNC summer meeting, the DNC passed Resolution 38, which welcomes the religiously unaffiliated into the party. It is worth noting that 4 members of the Nebraska delegation co-sponsored that resolution. I think that is a testament to how much we can accomplish within the Democratic Party when we simply engage in these conversations and make our case for representation. At that same meeting, I was elected co-chair of the DNC Interfaith Council, which leads up to this week's convention. Thanks to the Secular Democrats of America's advocacy, along with a coalition of like-minded organizations, faith partners, and members of the Democratic Party, the DNC's 2020 platform acknowledges the non-religious. It states, quote, "Democrats believe that freedom of religion and the right to believe or not to believe are fundamental human rights." The platform also commits to ending broad religious exemptions, rejects the politicization of religious freedom in American foreign policy, recognizes religious freedom as a core American value and a core value of the Democratic Party, and celebrates the paramount importance of separation between church and state. For the first time, secular Democrats truly have a seat at the table. And I want to thank the DNC for making this the most inclusive convention in history. And now I am thrilled to turn it over to Ron Millar, the Political Impact Coordinator for the Center for Free Thought Equality. You will then hear from Terry Pettigen, the Vice Chairman of the Secular Democrats of Texas, where this all started. Then you will hear from Rachel Walter, Chair of the Secular Democrats of Nebraska. We will then get to our panel of elected officials to dive into the issues. If you're on social media, please engage in the conversation with us using #secular and #DemConvention. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ron.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm Ron Millar, the Political Impact Coordinator of the Center for Free Thought Equality, which is the advocacy and political arm of the American Humanist Association. We have a connected political action committee, the Free Thought Equality Fund. The mission of this PAC is to increase the number of open humanists and atheists in public office. In the past 4 years, we've had several successes. We commissioned a poll which determined that the atheist taboo against running for office no longer exists. Voters care much more about public policy stances than they do about a candidate's religion or absence thereof. We were instrumental in having Congressman Jared Huffman, who you'll hear from today, announce that he's a humanist and agnostic. He is the only open non-theist member of Congress. We helped him and Congressman Jamie Raskin form the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, which is a membership group in Congress to foster science and evidence-based public policy and provides a forum for members of Congress to learn about the atheist and humanist movement. Through our PAC activities, we have identified over 50 state legislators who identify with the atheist and humanist community. This is up from just 5 state legislators prior to the 2016 elections. However, we need another 1,500 or so to reach parity with our population, so we still have a lot of work to do. I commend Sarah Levin for organizing this event and making inroads with the Democratic Party to recognize the atheist and humanist community as an important constituency. We are a growing voting bloc. In 2006, the religiously unaffiliated were 11% of all voters. In 2018, we increased to 17%. And I hope that we'll represent 20% or more of the voters in the upcoming election. In addition to being a growing constituency, the religiously unaffiliated overwhelmingly vote for Democratic candidates. Now, our community's active political engagement will help to promote evidence-based public policy to effectively address the issues that confront us, like the pandemic and climate change. Our active engagement will also increase the visibility of atheists and humanists and help diminish the lingering bias against our community. As an added benefit, our active participation in the political process will counter the Christian nationalists currently in power and help bring their bigoted, anti-science, racist, misogynistic, and homophobic crusade to an end. So thank you for participating in this event. Please join the Center for Free Thought Equality. Becoming a member is absolutely free. So thanks again for your participation. It's very happy to turn over the program now to Terry Pettigen of the Secular Democrats of Texas. Take it away, Terry.
Terry, you are on mute.
Okay, hi now. My name is Terry Pettigen, and I am a secular humanist. Now, at about the age 15 or 16, I realized I was not a believer, and I was about the only one in my family like that. And I just recently come out to my family that I am not a believer. Quite a shock to everyone. I feel like I'm really out of the closet now. Now, I am the vice chair of the Secular Democrats of Texas, and we are led by a dynamic young man named Kevin Price. He is an 11-year U.S. Army veteran and is passionate about advocating for everyone. Now, what have we done? We have worked on building our organization. We have done this by visiting various secular groups in parts of Texas. We have also recruited believers who know that the state should not be involved in religion. And I would like to quote Richard Dawkins on getting non-believers organized and to do something is kind of like herding cats. But we are persisting. We had a great fundraiser in the Dallas area. It was a drag queen competition and it was a very successful event. Now, the biggest project we have worked on is to ban conversion therapy for minors. Currently, there are 20 states and about 74 local communities that ban the practice. Now, most of the states that have banned it are on the West Coast and the Northeast. That's surprising, right? The states most likely to still allowing it are the Midwest and the South, the Bible Belt. Now how have we done this? After the fundraiser, we protested a place in Addison near Dallas. The guy that owns that did do it in California, but California banned it, so he moved to Texas. Surprising, right? Now we have worked with several Texas state representatives, Republicans and Democrats, to get a bill passed. Kevin has been persistent, but you can imagine what it's like getting someone getting something like that done in Texas. We have also contacted local representatives from Austin, Houston, Galveston, and some other smaller communities on getting local ordinances until we can get it passed statewide. We also had a Zoom meeting for our 2020 state convention. In 2018, we had about 250 delegates live in Fort Worth. And then we had around 200 in 2020 on our Zoom meeting. And that pretty much sums up our year. But next year, we already have some things planned. And that is, we're going to have some training by Anthony Magnabosco. He does a thing called street epistemology based on a book called Manual for Creating Atheists. And so it's a very non-confrontive way to ask people what they believe without telling them that they're wrong. And now I would like to pass the baton to Rachel Walter. Rachel.
Oh, thank you. I hope you're doing great down there in Texas. In Nebraska, as Sarah stated, we have some really great support among our state and our leadership to the DNC. And so we have been able, in the last 2 years, we are not quite a 2-year-old caucus, but we have been able to accomplish quite a bit. This year, we got some planks into our state platform, which include an absolute separation of religion and government, equal protection for all Nebraskans of faith and of no faiths, and I apologize, I'm gonna cough, and privileging no religious groups of one belief system over another. What we have really been working on, since we are a smaller caucus and we are a newer caucus, we are working on building our relationships within the party and building relationships with legislators. I do apologize. We have plans to reach out to the community to go out and do fundraisers and help our candidates. We were fortunate enough this year to have 4 candidates who were all secular or non-theist that we were able to endorse. And we want to be able to help any other candidates who come out as secular or as non-theist and help them get their message across that there is nothing that separates them when it comes down to the values of Nebraskans. We all want what is best for each other and not necessarily what is best for one religious group over another. We want all Nebraskans to be treated fairly and on equal ground. And that is what we are doing. I am very excited to be here. I'm very excited that this is happening. And as Sarah knows, I am just extremely excited that this is a thing that is now being a part of our fabric of being. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you to everyone who's here.
Thank you, Rachel, for your work, and thank you, Terry, for your work as well. It is now my great honor to introduce our panel of lawmakers, all of whom are champions of the constitutional separation of church and state, and all of whom are part of our secular community. Congressman Jared Huffman of California's 2nd Congressional District is here with us. We have Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland's 8th Congressional District. They are both founding members and co-chairs of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. We also have Representative Athena Salman, who serves as the minority whip of the Arizona House of Representatives and Arizona's 26th District, and Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith of Florida's 49th District. Representative Salman, Representative Smith are fighting tough battles in their home states of Arizona and Florida, and we are grateful to them for their tireless work. Thank you all for your work and for making the secular community feel heard and represented. We're going to start with remarks of each of you. I'm going to ask you all to mute your mics when you're not speaking, and we're going to start with Congressman Huffman.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm joining you from the beautiful north coast of California in Humboldt County. And it is just such an honor to be part of this panel. And I'm so delighted to see what you have done and what our party is doing to broaden the tent and to make sure that one of the fastest growing demographics in this country, folks who are non-religious, have a place within the Democratic Party. We have a place for our own concerns and issues, and I think increasingly we have common cause with thoughtful, progressive people of faith who, like us, don't want to live in a theocracy and see reason for alarm and common cause in pushing back against this encroachment into the secular character of our government. So that's what my friend Jamie Raskin and I have been working on for these last couple of years. After I came out as the lonely humanist in the United States Congress, I guess that's my claim to fame. I did talk to Ron Millar and others about the need to do more than just come out and have a press cycle about this novelty of being a non-religious member of Congress. Jamie Raskin's a pretty good guy to talk to about things like that, because he comes to Congress as a constitutional scholar, a law professor. He has forgotten more about real religious liberty and the Constitution than I'll ever know. So we all started talking about how we could institutionalize our concerns. And that led to the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. As far as I know, the first time that we've ever formed a caucus that is focused like a laser beam on pushing back against this push to theocracy that we see every single day. And I'm delighted that we're joined by colleagues in state government, because this is not limited to the United States Capitol. We know that Project Blitz is doing bad things in the name of religious liberty in many state governments. And sometimes the shadowy nonprofit groups and others that support those efforts emanate from the United States Capitol. So we do need to work together, and we certainly have common cause. The Free Thought Caucus is new. It's about 2 years old. We're really just getting started in figuring out how we can engage, how we can make our mark. But already we have been able to file amicus briefs in critical court cases where the separation of church and state was on the line. We've been able to lead congressional sign-on letters and to join with other caucuses in the Congress to do things like pass the BAN Act, the No Ban Act, and also in the appropriations process, leading congressional sign-on letters to make sure that as we send federal dollars out the door, we're not doing it in a way that imposes religion on people. For example, in these 12-step programs, we know we have a terrible addiction and substance abuse problem in this country, but publicly funded treatment programs should not carry with them a mandate to participate in religious dogma as a condition of getting the treatment that you need. So that's just one of many, many things. We're really just getting started with the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. And I won't go on too much longer, because we've got a guy who's far smarter about all of these possibilities than me. Right next to me on my Hollywood squares, Jamie Raskin. I'm so pleased that he joined me in founding this new caucus, and he's just a great partner in crime. But he's muted himself. He's not very good with technology.
Sarah, does that make it my turn? I was waiting for an introduction.
Well, Congressman Huffman beat me to the punch. I think he could do a better job than I can.
All right. Evidently, I need no introduction. I told them that, and they took me literally, I guess. Jared, thank you so much, man, for your kind words. And Jared Huffman has made history in the Congress of the United States by coming out as a non-believer and a secularist and a humanist. And I certainly declare myself to be both of those things. And it's been such a joy to work with him.
You just made news, Jimmy. Are you coming out as a humanist today?
Well, I've always been a humanist. I've always been a humanist, and I've always been a secularist, but I've never pronounced on the existence or the inexistence of divinity, and I don't see why anybody would be remotely interested in my views on that subject. So I think that's the only difference between you and me.
You could double the ranks of humanists in the Congress right now.
Well, the problem is that I would have to talk to my mother-in-law at length about this decision before I go forward with it. But look, from a constitutional perspective, I think that every member of Congress should be a member of the Free Thought Caucus. I mean, this is where Thomas Jefferson was. This is where James Madison was. This is where Alexander Hamilton was. you know, despite all of his aristocratic and monarchical pretensions. And I mean, the framers of our Constitution were part of the Enlightenment process, and they rebelled against centuries of religious warfare between the Catholics and the Protestants, every bit as bloody and vicious as the wars between the Shia and the Sunni in the Muslim world today. And they rebelled against the Holy Crusades and Inquisition and witchcraft trials, and they wanted to create what Jefferson called in that letter to the Danbury Baptists, the wall of separation between church and state. And for them, it was an obvious thing. If you have a union of church and state, it degrades religion, which should be between each person and God or his or her maker or his or her own beliefs, his or her own conscience. And it prostitutes government, it corrupts government. So government ends up trashing religion, using it for its own purposes, and religion ends up trashing the real purposes of government, which is in a democratic society to be an instrument of the common good and the public interest. And it should not be an arena for people to get together and fight about what God's name is and which God created us and when they did it and all of that stuff. The framers wanted to have nothing to do with it at all, which is why we've got the free exercise clause in the First Amendment. We've got the no establishment of religion clause in the First Amendment. And we've got a clause saying that there shall be no religious tests for anyone in public office. So you clearly have passed a religious test by taking one, Jared, but you didn't have to do that. Nobody required you to say that, but you know, it was obviously an act of political courage on your part to do it, and political strength, and a demonstration of the growing strength of humanists and secularists across the country. But I want to say that the principal goal that Jared Huffman and I have had since we started this is just to restore the founding understandings of America. Just nothing more radical than restoring the original conception of government as a place where we debate public things using reason, science, data, empiricism, not religious superstition, not conspiracy theory, not irrationality, not the dictates of this church or this sect or this cult or whatever, but rather we come together and we engage in what's essentially a rationalist enterprise of figuring out what public problems are and then setting to work to solve them. And right now, the crises that are besetting America require reasoned thinking, but instead all we get is, in the case of COVID-19, quack miracle cures, and the president expounding on the glory of injecting yourself with Clorox and bleach, and a constant dismantling of scientific expertise and the actual recommendations of public health experts. And when we look at climate change, again, that is the subject of nothing but conspiracy theory and irrationalism. So Donald Trump tweets out that climate change is a hoax perpetrated on the Americans by the Chinese. And I tweeted right back at him, no, Donald Trump is the hoax perpetrated on America by the Russians. That's a far closer statement of fact than what he said. But in any event, we've got to get back to using science, reason, logic, data, empiricism as the coin of the realm in politics rather than different kinds of religious dogma. I discovered this mass untapped constituency of millions and millions of people who are skeptics, who've had terrible experiences with religious violence or religious control or religious dogmatism, propaganda, and have you. Before I got into politics, Jared, I don't know if I ever told you this story, I testified in the Maryland legislature as a professor of constitutional law about the Republicans' proposed state constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage. And they wanted to write it into our Constitution that marriage is between one man and one woman. And I testified, and then a very right-wing senator who would come to be my friend when I got elected to the Senate, but I didn't know her at that point. Her name was Nancy Jacobs from Harford County. And she said to me, Professor, you keep talking about equal protection and due process and the Constitution. What about the Bible? My Bible says that marriage is between one man and one woman. And I said, Senator, with all due respect, when you took your oath of office, you put your hand on the Bible and you swore to uphold the Constitution. You didn't put your hand on the Constitution and swear to uphold the Bible. And that basic misconception that you're supposed to go into politics or government to uphold the Bible is pervasive still in so many state legislatures and so many town councils and school boards and in Congress itself. You know, we get it all the time. We get it from colleagues. You know, a day barely goes by when we don't hear one of our colleagues get up and talk about Engel versus Vitale, 1962, when the Supreme Court banned prayer in the public schools. That was the moral downfall of America, when the Supreme Court banned prayer in the public schools. And I always try to tell them, you know what? The Supreme Court didn't ban prayer in the public schools. As long as there are pop math quizzes, there will always be prayer in the public schools. Anybody can pray whenever they want in public schools. It's just that the government cannot dictate to people how they will pray or when they will pray or what the content of their prayers is going to be. So this is a major educational task, just restoring the basic constitutional vision. And if you look at John F. Kennedy's speech in 1960, when they were hounding him for being a Catholic, he said that what matters is not his private faith, but his public faith. And his public faith includes a belief in an absolute separation of church and state. He said things in that speech that the vast majority of our colleagues would not utter today. And that was, you know, in 1960, that was 60 years ago that he said it. So I want to thank Jared really for what he's done. And it's a great fun working with him and our other small group. I think we got 9 or 10 people who are out there on this, but every time, you know, another outburst of theocratic religious thinking occurs on the floor, we are right there to counter it. And we especially support our friends in the state legislatures I'm eager to hear from to talk about what they're doing out in a place where they might not even have as friendly an audience as we've got. So I yield back and thank you, Sarah Levin, for your great work.
Sarah, would you indulge just a quick afterthought after I hear?
Sure. And then we'll go to Representative Smith and then Representative Salman. Go ahead, please.
That's great. I'm so glad that Congressman Raskin talked about the immediate battlefront that we're fighting with the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. These two concurrent crises, the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, which, by the way, didn't go away while we were all focused on the pandemic, is a perfect example where fact-based, reason-based, enlightenment-based governing is the only way to effectively respond. And the magical thinking and religious dogma and other things that we've seen applied to these crises really are just making it worse and hurting a lot of people. The last thing I'll mention, which is something that Jamie Raskin and I pushed back on a few weeks ago with a really, I think, well-crafted statement on behalf of the Free Thought Caucus, was Secretary Pompeo's Unalienable Rights Commission and this report that they came out with, which is just such a sham. It is an attempt to take biblical prophecy and other things and impose them into our foreign policy and do bad things on reproductive choice and LGBTQ issues all over the world, and to elevate super rights. So throw out the Constitution. Let's take property rights and religion and elevate them as super rights because that's what God wants, not because it's anywhere in the Constitution. Pretty scary stuff. Because if you think about the other moment we're having in this country, which is confronting our original sin of racism and the institutions like slavery and segregation and Jim Crow that perpetuated it and continue to, property rights and religion kind of merged into the justification for all of that bad stuff. And here we go again. Secretary Pompeo is trying to drag us right back into that mess. So this is timely stuff. We have allies in the faith community, but I think it's actually a moment where good secular advocates can really shine. And I'm delighted to be working with all of you.
Thank you. Go ahead, please, Representative Smith.
Hi, well, good afternoon, secular Democrats. I am State Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, and I'm joining you all from Orlando, Florida. First of all, I just want to say it is such an honor to be here as part of this dialogue with Congressman Raskin, Congressman Huffman, Representative Salman as well. I watch what you do, the two of you do in Congress, Rep. Raskin. I take notes when you're on CNN talking about constitutional law all the time. So it's actually really, really surreal to be in this discussion with you all today. So I was elected in 2016 to the Florida House of Representatives. And I identify, of course, as a proud progressive, but also as a feminist, queer, Latinx, and an agnostic secularist millennial Democrat. And that's, I know, a mouthful, but I mean, that is who I am. And it's ironic that I represent a district in the Florida House of Representatives where, of course, I'm the minority. But I'm extremely proud to have a seat at the table because the Florida legislature is notoriously conservative. It is notoriously run by the religious right. And I often describe, although I don't often have the opportunity to do so with a national platform of advocates around the country, I often describe Florida as the front lines as it relates to the battle to keep church and state separate in public policy. I say that because, unfortunately, Florida is a case study of what can go wrong when we don't promote secularism in government. Specifically as it relates to Florida leading the nation for better, for worse, and I would say for worse, as it relates to the movement to privatize education. And what we have seen over many years here in our state, as it began with then Governor Jeb Bush a couple decades ago, was a movement towards privatization through private school voucher programs. Now, as we sit in the year 2020, the state of Florida has the largest private school voucher entitlement program in the country. We spend $1 billion, that's billion with a B, in Florida, of taxpayer money to divert money from our public schools into private school institutions through various private school voucher programs. A majority, but not all, of those private school institutions are sectarian institutions, so they're religious schools. And the way that Florida has set up our various school voucher programs is, of course, it would be very generous of me to say that the standards in our private schools are very low. The standards are actually almost non-existent. The Orlando Sentinel has done a wonderful job of investigating, reporting, and exposing some of the inadequacies in the private school voucher program, from understanding that there's no real standard for curriculum. We've found private schools funded with taxpayer dollars in Florida actually teach that humans and dinosaurs walked the earth together, that the civil rights movement in our country in the 1960s was really just started by agitators. There's just all there's and most famously in this last legislative session, it was discovered again through investigative reporting that at least 83 private schools in Florida funded by our school voucher dollars, taxpayer dollars, have expressly discriminatory policies in writing that say students who say I am gay or I am transgender will be expelled from the school. And so when I think about
I think we lost Representative Smith for a moment there. We'll just wait a few more seconds. If he doesn't come back, we'll go to Representative Salman and come back. All right. Tech support is on it. Representative Salman, do you mind going next and we'll circle back?
Yeah, that sounds great. Sarah, thank you so much for having me on this panel this morning. I echo the words of my colleagues that it is such an honor and a pleasure to be in such, not only with the fellow state representative Guillermo Smith from Florida, but also Congressman Huffman, Congressman Raskin. It's such a pleasure to be here with you as well. I actually have seen you speak in person, Congressman Raskin, back in 2017 at the Secular Coalition's national convening. So again, it's just such a pleasure to be here and to share the space with you.
It's great to be with you.
Thanks. And so as was mentioned, my name is Athena Salman. I'm state representative. You can kind of see my district in the background. I represent District 26, which is in Arizona, North Phoenix, West Mesa, North Tempe, South Phoenix, and the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. I'm a majority minority district, so there's a lot of diversity within the largest contingency being the Latino population, followed by Caucasian, followed by Native American and African American. So I have a synagogue in my district. I have 2 mosques in my district, a lot of churches in my district, and right outside of my district is actually the only humanist society in Arizona. You can literally throw a stone and from across my district. And for me, growing up in a very multicultural family, I am the daughter and granddaughter of immigrants. My dad's Palestinian from the Middle East. And so on my father's side, I have a lot of Muslim family members. And then my mother's side, my mother's a daughter of a German immigrant and a Mexican immigrant, both Catholic. And so, and then I'm a proud atheist, and my parents are atheists as well. So that is the beauty of this country, unlike so many other countries that exist throughout the world, is, people can come together, we can break bread, we can celebrate our differences, we can debate our differences, but at the end of the day, the Constitution protects all of us so that we can go and live the most free lives possible. And, I grew up, even though I grew up in a predominantly conservative part of Phoenix, I always appreciated the stories from abroad, the stories from so many different parts of the world. And those moments that have stuck with me the most in terms of my family stories that I carry upon my shoulders are the instances in which governments have denied these basic fundamental freedoms from their peoples and what that trickles out as a result. And as a state lawmaker, and as someone who from day one, when I ran for office in 2016, I was very open about being an atheist, because I do believe that we're living in an era where people, our constituents, voters want authenticity. They want people to show up, not despite of who they are, but because of who they are. And that doesn't just happen in elections, like that translates into how we govern. And so for me, when I am coming from a state like Arizona, which, so much solidarity with my friend from Florida in terms of the conservatism that dominates our political sphere, it feels like being on the front lines. It feels like being on the front lines of these deliberate yet incremental attacks on our Constitution, with the ultimate end goal of sending us back to an era where McCarthyism prevailed. People were anywhere from exiled, jailed, or stripped of their livelihood. I mean, that's the slippery slope that, quite frankly, my entire life we have been heading down, as a millennial. And it's very heartening to see this revitalization across the country, including Arizona, thanks in large part by our Secular Coalition affiliate, the Secular Coalition for Arizona, really taking an unapologetic of something that shouldn't be controversial. Like, there's a reason why it's called, and it was, the First Amendment. Like, the freedom to choose faith, or the freedom to not have any faith at all, that is the foundation, that is the very bedrock of this country. And I do believe this is one of the reasons why, historically speaking, America has been able to achieve such great successes. But because, and fortunately, Arizona is a swing state. I do believe that part of the presidential pathway to a Democratic a victory does include Arizona in those maps, which is very exciting. I would have never dreamed of this, especially 10 years ago. Like 10 years ago, we were a Republican majority state where, you know, the chairwoman of the education committee was openly talking about how the earth was 6,000 years old. Like, this is not, you can't make up this stuff at all. So to see where we are going and to defend against those attacks, and now, like in 2021, it is projected that my chamber at least is going to get the majority for Democrats. And fortunately, the Democratic Party has been a group that has embraced secularism and has embraced a large umbrella of so many different individuals and that diversity. We will see this new ushering of legislation and policy making. And I know Sarah will have more time to get into the reactionary role that unfortunately folks like myself, Representative Guillermo Smith, have to play in trying to stop the attacks on our United States Constitution and our freedoms. But I'm looking forward to working with the Secular Coalition, both nationally, locally, and other organizations that prioritize humanist and secular policymaking and government to actually imagine what our country and what our state legislatures should look like. So I'll just leave it there for now. But thank you again so much. It's a pleasure to be joined by everyone, and thanks to the entire audience who's watching this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Representative. We really appreciate having you here. Representative Smith, do you want to finish your point from earlier before you cut out?
I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Sarah. And I was listening to Representative Salman as well just now. There was literally a thunder clap that I heard, and then I found myself talking to myself in the dark. That's when you saw me cut off. We had a power shortage. You gotta love Florida. You just gotta love the weather here. But I think what I was in the middle of just saying is that, look, we have a problem here in Florida. We have many problems, but one of them being that we funnel so much taxpayer money into unaccountable private schools, religious schools, and we really, really are, I believe, the front lines of part of this fight that's happening across the nation to not divert money into religious institutions, specifically religious institutions that are teaching our kids and graduating students and putting them out there in society and in the workforce with bogus ideas. And so, you know, there's a lot of work that we have to do here in Florida, but I am really, really happy to be a part of this conversation and share some of my experiences from the front line. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. And I'm going to start with an opening question that relates back to something Congressman Raskin and Huffman also touched on, the magical thinking, the conspiracy theories that we're seeing coming out of this administration. So the Trump administration has not only completely mishandled the COVID-19 pandemic, but is actively promoting misinformation and conspiracy theories. What will it take to restore critical thinking and scientific literacy in our society and in government? And what actions are you and your colleagues taking to address these issues in policy? And I'll start with Congressman Huffman.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That's a hugely important question, and I'm sure there's not a single issue that we care about where this isn't hanging in the balance. I'll just chime in from the perspective of climate policy and environmental policy. I just finished about a 14-month stint on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, where we are trying to do something that the IPCC, the world's scientific authorities on this subject, told us we have to do. We're running out of time. We have to decarbonize the global economy, and we got to do it quickly. And so we put together a roadmap, a 500-plus page climate action plan to show how the United States can do that, and not only do it here, but also lead the world in the same direction to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So we hopefully have some chance of preserving a livable planet. You're not going to be able to do all this stuff if you subscribe to magical thinking, or if you believe in some faith-based solution to a climate crisis that is very real. So I just think it's maybe the most important front in which we are battling magical thinking and trying to elevate science. And we're trying to do it because we want to save a lot of people from incredible pain and hardship and suffering and dislocation that is going to happen if we continue down this path of denial and magical thinking. So that's my report from climate policy. I'm sure that our friends in the state legislature who are dealing with what this means in education and in all sorts of other critical aspects of our society have their own experience.
Thank you, Congressman. Representative Smith, I know you were just talking about, speaking of Florida and the weather, do you want to touch on this as well? Representative Smith, do you want to weigh in? Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I was muted for a second. Yeah, you know what? The thing that I would add to what Representative Huffman said is that in this day and age, what's really unfortunate, and I'm not entirely sure how to address it, but what we have specifically in the age of COVID is too often people are very easy to dismiss doctors and healthcare professionals and scientists because they perceive them as government authority figures. Now, depending on the person's title, they could be a government authority figure, such as a Surgeon General. But so many of the healthcare professionals and doctors that have been speaking in one voice during the COVID-19 crisis on issues like how effective wearing a mask is and social distancing. So most of them don't hold any positions of in government, and they therefore have no specific authority over individual citizens of the country. But what happens is many people who during these times, they perceive those healthcare experts and doctors as positions of government authority or individuals from government authority, and they therefore do not trust them because of their distrust of authority figures overall. And that has really hindered our ability as a country to really be able to push out important science-based information from those healthcare experts so that we can help flatten the curve, so that we can help slow the spread of COVID-19. And so obviously one of the solutions in making sure that individuals trust our healthcare leaders, that they trust those doctors and those scientists who were out there giving them the facts and the data specific information, the best data that's available at the time, is for us to not have government leaders like President Donald Trump and Republicans who repeat and parrot what he's saying, that discredit those figures, that discredit the Dr. Fauci's of the world, who don't have an agenda other than the best interest of public health in this country. And so that's why I think this week's conversations are really, really important in making sure that we elect Joe Biden so that we can have a government leader who will trust science, who will trust those healthcare figures who understand the facts and are understanding the science, but also that we are electing individuals to government who will help promote those messages based on science as well, all the way down the ballot.
Thank you. And I think the listeners will be proud to hear that Dr. Fauci actually counts himself among us. He identifies as a humanist. I found that out recently. Congressman Raskin, do you want to weigh in on this issue?
But I was interested in what Carlos was saying about how they will attack Dr. Fauci and other scientists for being government officials and making that sound conspiratorial and paranoid, which of course is a complete defeat for democracy, because in a democracy, the government is us. But the irony is that Jim Jordan, I've heard say repeatedly in our coronavirus response select committee, well, who's Dr. Fauci anyway? Who elected him? In order to undercut his authority. In other words, we're not going to cede any authority to him as a scientist or medical person, because we're going to make people believe he's part of the big bad government. But then when he comes and he talks about science and data, in order to attack him, he says, who elected you? Which is just a deranged question for somebody who's, you know, in the government working to bring us scientific information and data. The Republican Party is behaving like a religious cult in every salient respect. If Donald Trump wakes up and he tells them that the dictator of North Korea is our best friend, then he's our best friend. If he wakes up and says we're going to nuclear war against North Korea, then we're going to nuclear war against them. In other words, they've suspended all critical thought. They slavishly, cultishly follow whatever Donald Trump says, who's the most deranged person that we have in the US government. So it's a scary moment for us. And, you know, I like to say, right before he left Congress, the congressman from South Carolina, Trey Gowdy, said to me, you know, Raskin, the problem with you is you're a liberal. And I said, you know what, you're damn right I'm a liberal, because the heart of the word liberal is liberty. And if we're not for that, what are we for? What's our value? And I say, I'm also a progressive, because the heart of that word is progress. If we're not making progress, what are we doing? But then I really stuck it to him. I said, these days, I call myself a conservative, because I want to conserve the land, the air, the water, the climate system, science. I want to conserve the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, everything that they want to destroy. Everything that we've built in our society is what we're trying to conserve now. So for us, at the Democratic Convention, we are defending everything at this moment. We are a coalition of progressives, liberals, conservatives, everybody who wants to defend democratic government against these nihilists and zealots and cultists who call themselves a political party now.
Thank you for that. Representative Salman, do you want to weigh in on this issue as well?
Yeah, so I think that the three definitely did a great job really tackling the conspiracy theories and the misinformation, and how we do live in a government and a society right now where that critical thinking and science-based reason is not what's guiding government decisions. So to the point about what actions are you and your colleagues taking to address these issues in policy, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, we have the legislation ready to go. We have legislation that would enable workers to have paid sick times who are essential workers. We have legislation to expand unemployment, because Arizona is the second to last in terms of state benefit for unemployment, so that people can not risk their health if they lose their job and not lose their housing over their head. You know, so we have a lot of legislation that really tries to slow the spread of COVID-19. We as the Democratic Caucus, we've been working with our Senate colleagues, but at the end of the day, the problem is that the Republican majority in my state don't even get, like, it's gotten so bad, they won't even let us debate these bills. The moment that they move a bill, because we can't even introduce our bills, we can't even get it into a committee hearing or get it on the floor, they call the question, so our amendments won't even get moved. And when we try to protest the call to the question, they hold us to the standard of like, oh, that's not, your comments are not germane to the question on the floor. And meanwhile, we have things to address price gouging. We have to, so all that to say is one of the biggest things that the Democrats in Arizona, and I believe Democrats in states all across the country, are prepared to hit the ground running on day one in January 2021, is fundamentally fixing our broken democracy, and that starts with elections. The reason that these fanatics, the reason that these people who don't even represent the majority of Americans, if you ask the majority of Americans if they adopt or they believe in these conspiracy theories, if they think tax dollars should be siphoned to private schools, if they think women should go to jail for having an abortion and their doctor should serve, like in Arizona, we have an old law where it's mandatory minimum of 1 year up to 5 years in prison if you've had an abortion or provided an abortion. If you ask the majority of Americans, this is not the American agenda, but they've been able to hijack our agenda by rigging our election system so that the concentrated belief system of a few people who have concentrated money can go and buy these seats while suppressing people who look like me, who come from immigrant communities like me, from actually being able to cast a ballot, even though we're American citizens. The Republican Party is not guided by protecting our democracy. There has been studies, Pew and other research organizations have shown that the authoritarian tendencies of this constituency, of this group of Americans, is real. And so, you know, we have, I mean, Donald Trump, who's president, but he is the second Republican president in this millennial, in this century, who was not elected by the majority of Americans. The first being George W. Bush. Let's not forget that. Let's not whitewash George W. Bush and the damage that he and destruction he did to our democracy that Donald Trump is now building on today, right? So we are prepared. And the thing is, like, you know, at the national level, legislation is going to go a far way. It absolutely is. And our members of Congress with HR 1 is ready to go, hit the ground running, make some of those structural reforms at that level. At the state level, we need to talk about constitutional amendments to our constitutions. Arizona is the only state in the country that doesn't guarantee a constitutional right to vote. Even Mississippi in their state constitution has a right to vote. You know, so we have to think generationally. We have to think that with this round of redistricting, if Republicans are still in the majority in these state legislatures, even if the Democrats get the majority this round, we might, the process is rigged. And so we have to be thinking, if we are going to stop these conspiracy theorists who are literally forcing people back to work in a pandemic that kills people, we have to start with our elections and we have to start with our democracy. And, you know, that's what we're prepared to do in Arizona. But I would argue Democrats across the country are ready to fight this fight because we are fighting for the soul of our democracy.
Thank you, Representative. That was really powerful. I'm going to switch gears for a second to a related topic to all of this, a little bit specific to the Free Thought Caucus, but I do welcome Representative Smith, Representative Salman to weigh in as well. One of the stated goals of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus is to, quote, oppose discrimination against atheists, agnostics, humanists, seekers, religious and non-religious persons, and to champion the value of freedom of thought and conscience worldwide. Can you talk about the discrimination that the non-religious face and why it is important to create spaces like this one for atheists, agnostic, humanists, and other non-religious voices to be heard? And love to start with you, Congressman Huffman.
Well, thanks for that question. Look, I think anyone who is persecuted because of their faith views, whether it is a specific religion or non-religion, deserves our protection. It's just part of our obligation to each other as human beings. It's one of those universal values that you would think all of us would agree upon. We have Republican colleagues in the Congress who are passionate about protecting Christians who are being persecuted in the Middle East. And, you know, their concern for that type of universal human rights seems to end when you see the Uyghurs being persecuted in China, for example, or when you see ex-Muslims who are now atheists being harassed and in some cases murdered by Muslims. So I think we've got to step back and think about this in the context of these universal values that we should all share. It shouldn't matter what the religious label that might attach to an individual is. If they're being persecuted, we should care about that. And that's something that I think at the Free Thought Caucus we can, you know, try to bring folks along on it. And we have done that. I actually have a conservative Republican colleague from Nebraska who joined us for a very interesting discussion where we focused on Saudi Arabia and Iran and what those brutal theocracies are doing to religious minorities and atheists. And I think we touched a chord with him by engaging him on those terms. So I certainly want to hear Jamie's thoughts about this, but I just think our country is in such retreat when it comes to any serious concept of human rights and universal values. And we have a lot to say as secularists about what that really ought to mean and look like.
We've got a resolution to make as a central plank of U.S. foreign policy, taking down all laws all over the world against blasphemy, apostasy, heresy, any witchcraft, sorcery, all of these religious offenses. Right now, there are hundreds and hundreds of people all over the world, in Saudi Arabia, in Bangladesh, you name it, who are in jail for imaginary religious offenses. Somebody said something that some neighbor reported insulted the Quran. But what's interesting about it is that it is the secularists, it's the free thinkers. By the way, I wanted our name to be the Tom Paine Caucus, but that was too radical for Jared Huffman, so we stuck with free thinkers. But the 2.5 centuries later,
Thomas Paine in the Capitol. We're working on that.
We're working on it. We're going
to rehabilitate poor Tom Paine.
But it's the free thinkers, the secularists, who are allies with everybody. Because in some societies, it's Christians who are being vilified and scapegoated by Muslims. In some societies, it's Muslims who are being vilified and scapegoated by Hindus. In some societies, the cast of characters changes sides, but it's always the free thinkers who are defending people against religious persecution and also defending the free thinkers, because of course they're being persecuted in every one of these societies. And there are free thinkers, secularists who are our allies in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Saudi Arabia, and we need to be defending them along with the religious minorities who are being persecuted. So this is for real stuff. And the framers of our Constitution knew it. That's why they put into our Constitution that there shall be no religious tests for public office at all. That's why most state constitutions have it. That's why the Supreme Court in Torcaso versus Watkins said you can't make swearing on a Bible necessary for somebody to testify in court, that a person can swear or affirm in order to go forward. So that kind of discrimination still goes on in a lot of places, in a lot of civil society institutions like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, of course. And we're trying to stand up for everybody. I mean, that's the America that we believe in. By the way, I want to tell you guys a joke, because I always tell Jared that the religionists, they've definitely got the secularists beat on holidays. They still got much better holidays at this point, but we are a much funnier movement, and the secularists are far funnier than the religionists are. So anyway, here's a joke that I know, where St. Peter is walking up in heaven and he passes God's office. So he peeks in and he sees God has got his head in his hands like this. He looks really upset. St. Peter goes in and says, God, what's wrong? You look really upset. And God says, I am really upset. I'm in love with an atheist and she doesn't even know I exist. So Sarah liked it. I yield back.
I liked it. Are you saying you don't celebrate Darwin Day?
I wasn't even aware of Darwin. I guess we do a resolution on Darwin Day. Well, what are you supposed to do on Darwin Day? It's not exactly Mardi Gras. Well, what happens?
Some secular communities have big dinners and events. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways.
They go and they engage in natural selection.
Yeah.
You could say that.
We serve with people who really should be nominated for the Darwin Award as well. Some of the greatest minds of the 18th century are in the 116th Congress.
True. We have some colleagues who are like a living refutation of evolution.
Representative Salman and Representative Smith, would you like to weigh in?
I was gonna say specifically, Sarah, around what you were asking, which was related to why it's important for us to for us to create spaces for atheists, agnostics, and humanists to have their voices heard. There's one example that I want to share with you, which I think is really important. In the Florida House of Representatives, we have a tradition. And the tradition is that before the gavel comes down, where we begin a floor session, the speaker invites a minister of the day to perform an invocation, strategically to be in compliance legally with us not praying while in a government session. They do the invocation before we actually gavel in and take roll call. Now, I just think the whole practice and custom is not appropriate. And of course, 99.9% of those who are invited are basically either Baptist or some other denomination of Christianity. So there's no real diversity and representation from any religion or tradition. So what I did, though, is I found out the rules. The rules for declaring a minister of the day is first come, first serve. I requested a minister of the day to invite someone of my choice. I was granted the request, and in my first year serving in the legislature, I was fortunate enough to welcome the minister of the day, T. Rogers, who is known at UCF in my area here in Orlando as a humanist. And so what she did was she, as a chaplain, she delivered a humanist invocation to the Republican-led Florida House of Representatives, which is one of the only times I've ever participated in the invocation. And what was so great about that moment is, while I don't really support the tradition of doing this invocation right before we gavel in, I was able to use my role as a member of the legislature to bring in a humanist, to have a humanist invocation. And finally, I felt like our secularist movement and our secularist community was included in this tradition in the Florida legislature. I got a lot of people scratching their heads, certainly, who were wondering, aren't we supposed to say amen at the end of this? But I thought it was a really important moment. And, you know, for those of us who serve in government, where we do have that opportunity to use our platform to elevate voices within the secularist community, I think it's really, really important to do so, to promote that diversity.
Sarah, I'll jump in, and so it's interesting to hear other state legislatures, because in Arizona, in the House, it's actually in our rule book that we have to pray. It's Rule 7, subsection B, and it's after roll call. So it is a part of the official daily business. And it's interesting because it's member-led prayers. So the member can choose to lead by a prayer themselves, or they can choose to bring in a speaker with this, Speaker of the House's permission. So I couldn't take the credit. My predecessor before me, now State Senator Juan Mendez, back in 2013, started just one day a year doing secular or humanist invocations or prayers. And every single year, while he was in the House, the Republicans, like, it was almost like a sport to them. They were just like, ooh, how do we haze the atheist this time? Because he's also an atheist. And so he would just give his invocation, and they would either, like one time they weren't giving him the prayer date, and then they were like, fine, you can do the prayer on this day, but then they gave him that prayer because they had the pastor ready to go. So after he prayed, they were like, oh, there was no prayer given, and they had the pastor. Like it's crazy. So my first year when I got elected, on the 100th day of session, I did a secular prayer. And the Speaker of the House, like, it ended up being this big fight because another member got up and tried to counter pray. It's this weird, like, counter pray the atheist prayer. Like, it's actually ridiculous and absurd. Like, we actually have more important things to move on to, like governing a state. But the interesting
Hey,
thing,
Athena, you should ask for equal time when they pray then. You should have your right of reply after their prayers too.
Oh, well, the thing was, like, they had, like, it was so, I tried to rule 19, which is like, you can't impugn a member, right? They're like, if a member doesn't believe in a higher power, and I was like, obviously they're talking about me, and they can't impugn my motives. They can't, and the speaker was like, nah, no, they're in order, it's fine. So then finally in that moment, I called a point of order on my own prayer. And I was like, Mr. Speaker, we're obviously talking about my prayer. Did I violate Rule 7B? And I was really surprised because he was like, yeah, you did. And
you violated it by not referring to a higher power?
Yeah.
But your name is Athena, case closed.
and their higher power is Donald Trump anyway.
Yeah, no, most certainly. So it's just been some variation of that, like we didn't end up doing anything through the court system because there's already many state legislative prayer cases working their way up to this very scary Supreme Court that we have right now. But where we have found success is just fighting them back every single time. And I only do the prayer once a year because, again, I'm with Representative Guillermo Smith. Like, I just don't think this is appropriate in government in the first place. But if they're going to do it, I'm not going to single myself out. I'm going to participate in the process. And so it was interesting. This year was the first year that the Republicans didn't haze me. And I was like, wow, that's so nice. Like, look, I'm a normal person now, atheist equality, whatever. But then over in the Senate side, they decided to just completely go after Senator Mendez, which they hadn't been doing in the Senate. They were leaving those scrappy fights to the House because, we're like the people's house. We're a little rowdier than the Senate in Arizona. And so it's just like, you can never get a win. But I think having people who are openly atheists, who are humanists, who are secularists, not only show up as allies, but actually be individual members, it changes the conversation and it changes the dynamics, because now it's not like I'm discriminating against or I'm bullying someone on the outside. Like, the bullying actually happens to a fellow colleague and member, and you have to confront them. I don't just disappear. And my vote is just as equal. When I push that vote button, that's still one of 60 in the House. So, I do think that we moved the needle, but much credit, again, goes to my predecessors, the Secular Coalition and Senator Mendez, for starting to pave that way. And now in Arizona, like, members request, like, religious affiliated members request humanist prayers to give. So it's not just me giving a secular or humanist prayer. Like, I'll have to check with my Secular Coalition, but I think out of the 100-something days of session, like 15 to 20 of those days are a humanist or secular invocation. They only harass me because I'm the actual atheist. Like, they don't actually, get mad at the other members as openly, but progress.
Athena, we're fighting the same fight in the House of Representatives. Jamie Raskin and I and our colleague Mark Pocan have been pushing for a humanist invocation. 97% of the prayers in the history of the House of Representatives, as I understand it, have been Christian. And so we're getting there slowly but surely. The other way in which we're fighting a similar fight is the oaths that are required of witnesses to give committee testimony. And in the Natural Resources Committee, when we took over the majority, we proposed not having a mandatory affirmation to God as part of your oath as a witness. Liz Cheney went on Fox News and went ballistic about how we were choosing Satan over God in the Congress. To which I say, look, if I'm the one person who doesn't even believe Satan exists. I mean, the last thing I'm going to be doing is choosing Satan over God. Liz thinks Satan's a real thing. So you know, I think there's cause for concern there. But we're fighting these fights, and I thank you for what you're doing in Arizona.
Yeah, me too. You know, Athena's story reminds us that a lot of religion in America today is not about people's personal faith and conscience and relationship to God or spirituality. It's about power over other people and exercising power and bullying people and pushing them around. And so, you know, people often express puzzlement about, well, how is it that you've got, you know, millions and millions of church people who wrap themselves around the political fortunes and ideas of Donald Trump, who's about the most blasphemous, appalling, repulsive, sexual assailant, misogynist, misanthrope you can ever imagine. And it's puzzling only if you think that the purpose of religion is, as you know, Madison wanted it to be when you read his memorial and remonstrance against religious taxation, a matter of the person and God, the person and nature, the person, you know, kind of the transcendentalist image of what religion is. It's puzzling then, but if you think of religion as an exercise of social power over other human beings, it makes perfect sense. Donald Trump is their pathway to power and is the destruction of civil rights and civil liberties of everybody that they detest. And when you look at the number of churches that are involved in child sex abuse and stealing money from people and embezzlement and exploitation, you could be puzzled until you come to think, well, for a lot of people, religion is about that. That's why, you know, the Church of Scientology is out there, so they can take advantage of other people and exploit other people. And, you know, it's one of the costs of freedom in America, because anybody can create a religion whenever they want. And once you define it, you set it up, if people get into it, you know, a lot of abuse takes place there. But buyer beware. And it's important that we be as strong in advocating for secularism and freedom as they are out there proselytizing for cult control over other people's minds.
And I just have one to that point, Congressman Raskin. It's interesting because we just had in the state legislature, there was a very contentious, high-profile Republican primary, and it was a more moderate, considered moderate. You know, we've moved so far right in this country. But anyway, a more moderate, more secular leaning Republican versus like the religious rights, like creme de la creme, like anti-vaxxer, anti-freedom of a woman's rights to choose, you know, going after transgender children, like that type of Republican. And that Republican serves in the House. The other Republican was the incumbent in the Senate. And one of the main reasons why the Republican in the Senate, and she ended up losing her seat, one of the main reasons that she was primaried by this extreme religious right Republican was in Arizona. We just had a fight back in 2019 where two Republicans caucused with the 13 Democrats to derail the budget negotiations to provide children who are survivors, well, now adults, right? But adults who have survived child sexual abuse, more time to civilly sue their abuser. Because in Arizona was the lowest amount of times in terms of statute of limitations. Once you turned 18 in Arizona, previous to us derailing the budget and enforcing this law through, you only had 2 years. So by the time, you only had until you were 20 years old to process to you and sue your abuser. And so, you know, I think to your point, like it's definitely not this hypothetical, like Republicans, and it's interesting because like 10 years ago, a Democrat tried to run this bill. A Democrat tried to fix this, because this isn't a, you know, when you really peel back the layers of oppression, especially as it comes to abuse and sexual trauma, like the state laws, maybe congressional too, but state laws would just be appalling to you. And 10 years ago, I believe, a Democrat tried to run similar legislation to fix this issue, and actually got primaried and taken out by you know, the local Catholic organization here in Phoenix, or here in Arizona. So it's it's like the intersection between policy making and what should be in the best interest of our constituents. There are consequences, especially on the Republican side, when you take that stand for science, for reason, and for, survivors of trauma. And we just saw that play out in the Republican primary. And unfortunately, that anti-vaxxer woman that was going after transgender girls this session, she won that seat. And that bill was a huge reason why that Republican was targeted, because she was standing up for again, adults who survived childhood sexual abuse. Like to most of us, that is just mind-boggling. That is just not controversial. Give them more time to seek justice. But this is the reality. This is the at least in Arizona, like this is, but I would.
Well, in the Republican Party, the more religiously authoritarian is going to beat the less religiously authoritarian. In every case, we're seeing it across the country. That's what Trump has done in terms of demolishing critical thinking skills. I wanted to ask Carlos whether he's had, what his experience in Florida has been like compared to yours in Arizona. Like you've got such wonderfully aggressive secular politics and vision. How are people responding both in the legislature and then in broader Florida society?
Well, thank you for that, Rep. Raskin. One of the things that you mentioned before, Rep. Raskin, was how freedom of religion has been weaponized against certain communities. And when I sit here and I reflect on what religious freedom means to me as an individual, not just as a lawmaker, because of course some people, specifically our opponents, they like to assume that, secular Democrats, they must, oppose freedom of religion. No, quite the contrary. We support freedom of religion, but freedom of religion also includes freedom from religion. Freedom from religion is also a very, very important value and concept that affects me directly as a human, because in my experience in the Florida legislature, what I continue to see is that religious freedom is weaponized specifically against the LGBTQ community. We have seen bills in the Florida legislature where religious exemptions have been carved out, where they have said, we're going to allow for adoption agencies to discriminate against same-sex couples, against LGBTQ couples, which is an example, of course, of weaponizing it, carving out more religious exemptions in our civil rights protections that would say that they could fire someone for being LGBTQ in the workplace. And what is very interesting to me, which I think is important to be included as part of this conversation, is how the weaponization of religious freedom against other communities is actually another reason for us to broaden our coalition with other like-minded groups. For example, I often talk about how reproductive freedom, the reproductive freedom movement, the feminist movement, is directly tied into the LGBTQ civil rights movement in similar ways that the secularist movement, all of our interests are often tied together. When I think about a woman's right to choose, we think about, this is about a broader right of individuals to live their private lives free from judgment from politicians or from government. And when you think about reproductive justice as well, you think about bodily autonomy. And that's about the right to have children and also the right to not have children, which relates directly and intersects directly with abortion rights and LGBTQ rights. So when we think about all of this, and you think about, Hobby Lobby, remember Hobby Lobby? That court case was the weaponization of religious freedom as part of the Affordable Care Act. They wanted to carve themselves out and say that they did not have to provide birth control to their employees because it was against their religion. So these weapons have been used against our movements, and I think that true liberation for all of us, liberation for secularists, liberation for feminists, liberation for LGBTQ people, these are all tied together, which is why it's so important that we build coalitions to beat back these efforts to weaponize religious freedom.
There's a great book by Sarah Jacoby called Free Thinkers, which is about how coalitions of free thinkers and progressive religionists of all faiths have been the heart of every major radical movement to change America. The abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement. I mean, you think about the civil rights movement, you've got Dr. King and SCLC, which is really rooted in the Black church, but then you got the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was made up of, you know, Bob Moses and Ivan O. Donaldson and Mary Berry and John Lewis, and they were free thinkers. You know, they weren't going to church on Sundays. They were free thinkers, and they were, a number of them were very, you know, avidly secularists, but it was the coalition that got together to change America. It's a great book.
And actually, I'm always for an author named Sarah, but it's Susan Jacoby. I think my name might be on your brain.
Susan Jacoby.
So I want to ask the closing question, and I wish we could continue. We have to move on to the next panel. But thank you so much for all the time you were able to give us. For our closing question, under the Trump administration, oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Yes, it is. Okay. Under the Trump administration, the Christian nationalist movement has made unprecedented gains in their agenda. What would you like to see in a Biden-Harris administration that would reverse the damage done and restore religious freedom policy that values pluralism and is aligned with our constitutional principles? And I'll add to that question, please, any calls to action that you have for the folks watching today. And I'll start with you, Congressman Raskin.
Well, let's see. One is the anti-blasphemy, heresy, sorcery resolution. We've got to try to free religious/political prisoners all over the world. And we should simply say that that's just a fundamental precondition of our relationship with all of these countries, that we don't sanction people being put in prison because they violate somebody else's religious biases, you know? So that would be number one. Number two is, and I think Carlos was hinting at this, I mean, the major push of the Trump administration has been to transform my religious right of free exercise into a commercial right or a corporate right to discriminate against other people to prevent them from leading their lives as they see fit. And that was, you know, the whole trajectory of the Hobby Lobby decision. But Jared and I have to vote on this kind of stuff all the time. The Republicans basically, you know, they want to say, well, if somebody's a clerk in a clerk of court and they disapprove of same-sex marriages, they shouldn't have to give somebody their marriage license. Well, what if they disapprove of interfaith marriages, or they disapprove of interracial marriages? I mean, we dealt with exactly this manner of claim back in the 1960s. It's the same thing with, well, you know, if somebody owns a small restaurant or a small hotel or motel and they don't want to serve gay people, why should they have to? That's their religious freedom. Look, your religious freedom guarantees you the right to go to whatever church, synagogue, mosque you want to, or none at all. It covers your right not to invite people over to your house if you don't want to see them. But if you enter the stream of commerce and you become a public establishment with all of the rights and privileges and benefits that confers upon you, yes, you are subject to the civil rights laws, and you can't discriminate against anybody based on race or sexual orientation or religion and so on, regardless of what your religious views are. If you go back and you look at those cases, Heart of Atlanta Motel, Ollie's Barbecue, all of those cases were about how the racist hotel owners in the South or the lunch counter owners didn't want their religious rights impinged upon, or they didn't want their right of freedom of association impinged upon. They're just reenacting that same old history. So I think that Black Lives Matter and the resurgent new civil rights movement we have can help to remind people that when you're in the stream of commerce, everybody's got a right to be served, you know, so that people aren't driven into, you know, the underground. And I would hope that a Biden-Harris administration would be very emphatic about that. And then just more in terms of just kind of the pluralist politics of it all. you guys have been doing such a great job, and we've got these extraordinary state legislators from around the country. Recognize this is a huge group. Tens of millions of people identify with what the people on this Zoom call are saying. And it's a great movement that's forming and coalescing around the country, and they should include it. And you know, I love Carlos's introduction because I take it, I hope I'm not offending him, but he seems like a millennial, and the millennials, they understand identity politics and American politics. And this is a real movement of people who identify as secularists, as humanists, who want to be courted, and they want to be included, and they want their views respected. And after all, their views go back to the very beginning of the Republic.
And I want to also answer the question and also respond to what Rep. Raskin was saying about identity politics, because we often hear about identity politics as a pejorative. You know, they're like, oh, you know, why are you gonna bring identity politics into this? What we have to remember, especially as secularists, as atheists, you know, when we talk about our secular identities, we're bringing an experience attached to that identity that helps us navigate the world, but also helps us govern. And then when we talk about other identities, as I identify as a queer Latinx person, you know, that's not to play identity politics. It's to remind people that my experience as a Latino man, my experience as a gay cisgender man, that these are relevant experiences in navigating the world that have to be represented with a seat at the table, because every law that's passed impacts different communities in different ways. So that's why I push back on the idea that identity politics is a bad thing or a pejorative, because this is about bringing our experiences to the table. You know, we have the first Black woman as the vice presidential nominee. That's not to play identity politics. It's to remind folks that her experiences have power, they're relevant, and they have to be represented in the administration. So what the other thing I'll say is you talked about what changes, like, do we want to see as part of this administration to reverse some of the damages. I don't know if this is something that could be a federal policy, but in Florida, I'll say, you know, so much damage has been done there. I don't see a practical outcome where we could, for example, shut down $1 billion worth of voucher school programs in our state. And many of our voucher programs in the state actually have value. For example, they cater to students with disabilities and with special needs, for example. We don't want to get rid of those programs, but there have to be standards. For example, and I generally am not supportive of sending taxpayer money to religious schools, but if we are going to do that, which we do in Florida, unfortunately, and we can't really reverse it, then we need to make sure that state law prohibits a religious school from receiving taxpayer dollars if they discriminate against LGBTQ students or LGBTQ families, for example. We did see a Supreme Court case recently that came down on voucher schools, but it was silent on whether state governments, or I think the federal government, were able to put these types of criteria forward as a condition of participation. So we still have the ability to enact these fair and equal standards out there. And what I'll close with is, please follow me at Carlos G. Smith on Twitter. And I was looking at the Q&A, and I want to give a shout out to the Saganists, because I saw someone say, we celebrate Carl Sagan holidays, which my husband loves because he has me watching Cosmos all the time, where Carl Sagan comes up all the time. So just want to give a shout out to the Saganists out there.
Thank you. Representative Salman, and then we'll close out with Congressman Huffman.
Great. Yeah, no, this is such a great closing question. And what I would like to see under the Biden-Harris administration that would reverse the damage done and restore religious freedom that values pluralism is an emphasis and an actual plan and execution of a strategy that takes back the courts. I mean, that's the bottom line. And we face the same thing in Arizona. You know, Governor Ducey is like our own mini Donald Trump. He just tweets less. But, you know, the fundamental restructuring, putting people who are not qualified, again, in Arizona, we have people who are not qualified to be on the state Supreme Court, who are there because of partisan political reasons. And we saw it play out with John Kavanaugh. We saw how the Republicans denied Merrick Garland the seat so that they can appoint John Gordon. Like, they fundamental, and that doesn't even cover all the courts between the Supreme Court and all the way to that first stop. And this administration, and you should check, especially if you're in a Republican majority state, you should check your state court system. But what the conservatives and the religious extreme right have done effectively is they have provided a generational guarantee that if and when the Democrats take over, which we are on the precipice of that happening, they can continue to stop a secular agenda that uplifts and prioritizes humanism in its rawest sense, right? The value and dignity of a human life, and ensure that that religious theocracy and dominance continue to creep through and control our lives. And I really hope, I'm very hopeful that what we'll see this election year is a 2008 moment where we have the trifecta. I understand at the US Senate level, because of the seats that are up, that it's hard, but I do think Mark Kelly in Arizona is going to beat Martha McSally, our unelected United States Senator. So I am hoping with the Biden-Harris administration, if we get a Democratic Congress and a Democratic US Senate, like, we are ready to fight for our courts. Because otherwise, like, I mean, don't get me wrong, Democrats being in the majority is always better than Republicans being in the majority. Like, that's the bottom line. That's where we're at as a country. We've already covered the reasons how they become, you know, anti-democratic and just mirror somewhat of a cult, right? But if we are actually going to realize our true potential, and if we're going to do it sooner than waiting until I'm 70 or 80 years old, like, we need to address the fact that they rigged our court system today. So I'm very hopeful, and I think that anyone who says that it's impossible are the people who have the most to lose by a court system that is actually fair, that is actually just, that actually upholds the letter of the Constitution and what it's supposed to be doing. And, you know, we just need to keep demanding it, because there is so many lives at stake before the pandemic happened, but especially now that we are in a global pandemic with no end dates. You know, we need to fight like everyone depends on it, because at the end of the day, when Democrats get the majority, that's only step one. And these reforms, like, I'm hoping that we get that generational change that they were able to win during the civil rights movement. Just that kind of impact we should be imagining, and we should be believing in ourselves that we can do that today, because we are no different than the great people of the past. We have that potential. So I have high hopes for Biden-Harris administration. I'm very excited, you know, to have Kamala Harris as our vice presidential pick. And I know with Congressman Huffman and Congressman Raskin and all the Democrats who are going to be joining you next go around, we're going to be in really good hands. And we as legislators, and we the people who are watching, we have your back.
That, I think, brings it around to me, Sarah. So I have some thoughts in response to your question about what we want to see from the Biden-Harris administration to push back against this Christian nationalism. But let me begin by thanking you, Sarah, because this is a first at a Democratic National Convention. And it's in large part because of your incredible efforts and competency and passion. So I think this secular community owes you a big thank you. And I think you're starting something that's going to continue and just get bigger and better in the years to come. Also, just a real treat for me to be part of a fantastic panel. I've enjoyed listening to every one of the other speakers. The first thing that I don't just want, I know and expect that will be different on this Christian nationalism issue is that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are authentic. They are real people. And that is unlike our current president, who's a fraud and a faker and a demagogue. Everyone knows he's not religious, but look at the way he weaponizes and cynically, cravenly exploits religion to help himself. It is just going to be night and day to have real, thoughtful, authentic people who aren't frauds weaponizing and exploiting religion in the highest office in the land. I liken the terrible scene on June 1st at Lafayette Park to our own Reichstag fire, because this is the playbook of fascists. They exploit conflict and chaos. They sweep in with this mix of nationalism and religion, and they seize power. And that's exactly what Donald Trump tried to do in that awkward way, holding the upside down Bible that somebody loaned him. It's awkward, it's inept, but he is trying to do what fascists have done throughout history, and that is to exploit religion very cynically, very disingenuously to do bad things. And we're going to get real thoughtful people in office that would never do anything like that. You know, Joe Biden's a person of faith. I think we all know that. And I respect the thoughtful way he practices his faith. He reminds me a lot of Nancy Pelosi. And I will just tell you that when I went to Nancy Pelosi and said, I'm coming out as a humanist, and I realized that that might be provocative to some in our party who think we need to lean in more on religion, reach out to the faith community and do more to compete with Republicans who've sort of captured that lane. I felt I owed it to her to give her a heads up and talk this through. You might be surprised to know that Nancy Pelosi, this devout Catholic, someone who really practices, she does pray for Donald Trump. She's the real genuine deal when it comes to faith. She told me she thought humanism was beautiful, and she wished more members would be authentic about who they actually are. So let's not underestimate the value of just having that kind of leadership in the presidency and the vice president. It's a big, big deal. And I'll just close with 3 specific things that I know will make a difference as well. One is appointing a Secretary of State who doesn't bring biblical prophecy to our national security and foreign policy, as if we need to hasten the apocalypse and live out these weird, destructive Book of Revelations scenes. That's what we got right now in Mike Pompeo. It's scary, it's dangerous, and we need to just totally pull back from that and restore again, rationality and our real national security and foreign policy interests in place of that craziness. Appointing an attorney general who doesn't bring some extreme Opus Dei agenda to the highest law enforcement office of the land. And then appointing Supreme Court justices who do away with this notion that religion, even if it's corporate religion, is somehow a free pass to discriminate and do bad stuff that would otherwise be unconstitutional. Those are big, big changes I think we're going to get from this president and this vice president. I'm excited to be part of it. And whatever your religious views in the days ahead, let us all pray for Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Thank you all, Congressman Huffman, Congressman Raskin, Representative Athena Salman, and Representative Carlos Guillermo-Smith for your leadership. We need more elected officials like you, and we are committed at Secular Democrats of America to mobilizing secular Democrats to make that happen. Thank you again for being with us. So moving on to our next panel, too often the non-religious are characterized as being without morals, without values, without a sense of meaning, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. Not only do we have strongly held beliefs about right and wrong, we have faith in humanity. We make meaning in this one life and world that we have. And for many of us, science and our awe of the natural world provides a great sense of meaning and purpose. I couldn't think of 2 better people to discuss this than my dear friend Greg Epstein, humanist chaplain at MIT and Harvard, and just lost my screen here, and Andrian, who is the writer, producer, and director of Cosmos, and her Peabody and Emmy Award-winning series, Cosmos, has inspired millions of minds across the globe, and she's here to discuss where we are today and the future of our world. We're honored to have you, and now I will turn it over to Greg.
Thank you so much, Sarah. What a great panel. Just one comment, is Rep. Raskin still there? He's still there. Rep. Raskin, I just wanted, Darwin wants to chastise you for a second. That was a brilliant panel, but you did say that, you know, we didn't have great humanist holidays, and this guy, Charles Darwin, did attend a party at Harvard, your alma mater, where we had 700 plus Harvard students that were lining up to get into the Darwin Day party on his 200th birthday. So there you go. We have humanist holidays. Andrian is a humanist hero. She created Cosmos along originally with her late husband, Carl Sagan, and was also the writer-producer-director for both new Cosmos series and the creative director for NASA's Voyager Interstellar Message Project, in which golden records were affixed to both the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 spacecraft that launched in 1977 and are now still sailing on and reporting back to us about 12 to 14 billion miles from Earth. So, Anne, first question for you. A few months ago, it was becoming clear that the Trump administration's response to COVID-19 was dangerously anti-science. And Vice President Biden tweeted, "We need a president who believes in science." What does it mean to you to believe in science? How do you think Democrats or progressives should be articulating this idea in the run-up to the election, and why?
And we need to unmute you and see your camera.
No. Hi there.
Hey there, I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties, and I'm thrilled to be with you, Greg. And I thank Susan for the beautiful introduction. And forgive me because we had a computer crash here just as you were speaking, Greg. So I don't know if you had a chance to pose the question to me.
Yeah, it's this idea of the Democratic, or the idea of the president in general who believes in science. Yeah, how do you think that Democrats or progressives should articulate that idea of believing in science? I mean, you're in better position than pretty much anybody to know.
Well, thank you. You know, it's not a matter of believing in science, because the wonderful thing about science is that it's a permanent revolution, that the findings that we hold dear at this moment, we will award the highest reward to the person who can prove them wrong. That's the power of science. It's a methodology. And most critically in this election, it's a way of knowing if you're being lied to. We are big liars, we humans. We lie to ourselves, we lie to each other. And our current leader, I think, is up to, 11,000, 12,000 documented lies during his term of office. So of course, science is his worst enemy. You can't pick it up on the golf course. You can't have your father buy it for you. It requires a devoutness, an adherence to reality, a dispassion in gathering the evidence and looking at the evidence coldly. But once the evidence is in, there are conclusions to be made. And in this case, in our case, with 170,000 of our loved ones gone, perished needlessly, and facing a climatic catastrophe, the likes of which even our most distant ancestors never had to endure. And here we are, And of course, Donald Trump hates science, and he believes that you can change the meteorological map with your magic marker. You can purge the agencies, the government agencies of the climate scientists who have the courage to report on their findings. But nature will not be deceived. Nature will not be lied to. And this is our current struggle. Are we going to allow this perversion, of reality, this flight from reality into fantasy, into prejudice, into delusion? Are we going to let it rob us of our children's future and our grandchildren's future? We claim to love them. And this is our chance to show that they are not merely extensions of our egos. They are not merely accessories to our vanity, but they are our future. And so, of course, Donald Trump has contempt for science, because in order to become a scientist, you have to know something deeply. You have to work at it. You can't lie your way to Mars. You can't lie your way to the stars in a mission of discovery. There are tens of thousands of people involved in every one of those missions, each responsible for a single step. And if one of them lies, then the mission will go horribly awry. That's the point. So to me, science and democracy are completely inextricably linked, because each of them is an error-correcting mechanism for our flaws as primates. And so I think that when we work to elect Biden and Harris, when we go door to door, when we vote, when we contribute that money, when we write those petitions, sign those petitions, what we're doing is we're standing up in defense of science, in defense of democracy, and in this case, in defense of our children and our grandchildren.
Beautifully said. And I want to ask you to sort of expand or double down on that kind of answer in this next question about science and really caring or compassion. You know, you've been known now as this force, the co-creator of Cosmos, which, by the way, Cosmos to me as a humanist chaplain is about the closest to a secular sacred scripture that has ever been created for any screen anywhere ever. But I think what you could be better understood and appreciated for is your passion for what I would call the heart of science and the heart of humanism. To me, you symbolize the idea that reason and critical thinking they're at their best when paired with compassion and caring. And, you know, I don't think people realize that about you unless they're really, really following you closely, which they should. So you wrote the famous line attributed to Carl Sagan, but you wrote it, now the genesis of the title of your daughter Sasha Sagan's brilliant book, For Small Creatures Such as We. And the line is, for small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love. That's a line that I wish secular Democrats and Democrats of all kinds would have in their heart and on their tongue at all times. Can you talk about what that statement really means to you and how it's relevant to this convention, to this party today?
Thank you so much. And I'm so proud of Sasha Sagan. And I urge everyone to read For Small Creatures Such as We. It's a masterwork. Okay, well, for me, and maybe it's because my understanding of science, which is limited, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a hunter-gatherer of stories. But I love science because I see science as a way of loving nature with a degree of humility that is what is called for in the greatest kind of love that we feel for each other. I mean, my love for another is not me cherishing my delusions about who that person is. and pretending to myself that they, making them a kind of figment of my fears and my desires. Real love, true love, lasting love is to look as unflinchingly and as squarely as you possibly can at the other and love them as they are. And that's what I love about science. It's not imposing projections of what we want to be true, and in the way that it has displaced us from our fantasy of being at the center of the universe. That's exactly the process of growing up. When you're an infant, you're allowed to feel that you're the center of the universe. But the process of growing up is that dawning realization that you're part of something much bigger than yourself. And so what I hope that people feel is not a desire to make people who disagree with them feel small or stupid. And I think that's critical to connecting with other people, is not to think of how you can show them how smart you are or how much you know, but instead to open yourself up. And so the rigor of science is important, as I said earlier, in assembling our current flawed but soaring vision of nature and the universe. So much of nature and so much of the universe was foreclosed to us until we developed this error-correcting mechanism called science, this method of science, these 5 or 6 simple rules to figure out what's true. And so, I think of Carl Sagan, and I think of him as an exemplar of never speaking to impress people with what he knew, but only to connect. And that's what we have to do with each other. I have been very fortunate in my life in knowing people who were profoundly devout, religious, orthodox. And that has been a kind of a way for me to understand that there are people who disagree with me and who haven't come to the same conclusions that I've come to. But as Carl and I and Al Gore and the religious community of the 1980s, when we were fighting for realization about climate change, we all said to each other, the bishops, the priests, the rabbis, the imams, and the scientists, you don't have to agree on how creation came to be in order to want to protect it and to preserve it. And so, I feel, having been so blessed my life through by my grandparents, my parents, the love that I was given and the love that I have experienced as an adult, I feel so profoundly that there are places where we can meet, and there's no victory in snickering at the people who are not there yet, or who will never be there, or someplace else where they're perfectly happy. We have to work to communicate with each other. That is one of our survival advantages that we have to use with wisdom and with kindness. Finally, I'd like to say that yes, science and scientists have known sin. They have created weapons of mass destruction. They have given us tools that we are not wise enough or mature enough to have at our disposal. That's all true, completely. But in science, there are also redemptive powers, remediative powers to save our environment. And they are the only ones that I know of. We have to do this. We have to accept this great gift, this great power. And instead of using it just for acquisitiveness and for consumption, we have to begin to use it to protect our lives and those of the future generations.
Thank you so much. I have one last question for you, and it goes to you mentioned your parents and your grandparents and the love that they shared and how influential that was on you. And I want you to tell that story just a little bit more, and for the following reason. You know, secular humanist Americans, we're not new to this Democratic Party coalition, right? This is not a new thing that we're part of this party, but to being leaders in political, cultural, civic life. But it is really new for us to be explicitly included as such, by name, with acknowledgement, with events, with speakers at a convention like this one. And I'm thinking, with some compassion right now for people who aren't that familiar with humanist philosophy, the way that Speaker Pelosi told Representative Huffman that, it's a beautiful thing. Well, not everybody knows that it's a beautiful thing. And, I'd love for you to just tell a little bit of your personal story of your family's journey to humanism and secularism as a way of illustrating who we are and what our worldview can offer the world for those who aren't familiar.
Well, my grandparents were very poor people. They came of age in what is now Belarus, but which was Latvia when they were young. And my grandmother grew up on a farm, and she learned to read because my great-grandfather said to the Hebrew teacher who had come to teach the boys, he gave him a bag of onions and he said, teach the girl too. And she read for 100 years after that. And so, it was small things like that that really, I think, contributed to our family and certainly to who I am. Okay, so my dad, who was one of the greatest loves of my life, was completely secular. And yet his parents were profoundly orthodox. If a dairy fork happened to meet a meat fork in a drawer, my grandmother would go out and bury the two in the backyard for a year because of that she was glatt kosher. She took it very seriously, profoundly. Okay, my father and my grandparents were like this, I never even saw my father, who had worked his way through college, who was an educated person. I never even saw him once give his parents so much as a dirty look. There was no tension between them. They adored each other. So one day I said to my dad, how is it that you don't believe in God? And Grandma and Grandpa are so profoundly religious, so observant, and yet you love each other and you get along so well. And my dad told me, it was in my first year of college at NYU, and I got on the subway, my heart was pounding. I went to Queens, to my parents' house, and I went upstairs to find my father. And he was sitting at the kitchen table, and he had phylacteries on, with these leather thongs in this box, and he was wrapped in a tallis and a prayer shawl. And he was davening with his eyes closed, moving back and forth. And I just stood there shaking in my shoes. And he opened his eyes and he saw me standing there and he looked at me as if I was the answer to his prayers. And he got up to embrace me. And I said, my father speaking, I said, no, Pop, nope, I got something to say, just a minute. I'm not going to pray anymore. I'm not going to keep kosher. I'm going to ride on Shabbos. I'm not going to do any of those things because it's all a bunch of BS. And I said to my father, what did Grandpa say? What did he do? And he said, my father came and he threw his arms around me. And he said, well, the only sin would be to pretend. It's that sin of pretending that is so corrosive. My grandfather, he believed in God, truly. He walked to the shul when he was dying of cancer, even though he didn't have to because it was Shabbos. But he also knew that if you really believe, you don't have to impose that belief on anyone else because his God knew everything, and he could see the liars.
That's beautiful. I love that story. Don't you love that story, people watching on Zoom? And that's really, by the way, you don't have to impose belief in secularism or humanism or atheism or agnosticism on anybody either. I have a small son, and I want to be your grandfather in any way that I need to be when my son turns out to be different than me, whether religiously or whatever else. This story that you just told to me is the model for the kind of relationship that secular Democrats and religious Democrats, secular Americans and religious Americans, secular people and religious people can have the world over. Thank you, Ann. It's always such a pleasure talking to you. You're one of the most important thinkers and doers in the world to me and to many others. And I'm delighted that we were both included in this event by Sarah and the secular Democrats. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Greg, the pleasure, the honor, the joy was mine. Thank you so much. Please, everyone, vote, vote, vote. Please, please, let's begin to undo the damage. Thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It is now my honor to introduce our panelists who will be discussing the intersection of Christian nationalism and white supremacy. As our nation reckons with our racist past and discusses a path forward, we wanted to ensure that Black non-religious voices are heard and included in the conversation, and to bring to the attention of Democrats concerned about racial injustice that Christian nationalism is a piece of the bigger picture that we should not underestimate and should seek to understand. To help us understand these issues, let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Dr. Robert Jones, the founder and executive director of the Public Religion Research Institute, a nonpartisan organization, and author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity and the End of White Christian America. We have Ashton P. Woods, the chair of the Black Humanist Alliance and the founder of Houston Black Lives Matter. And we have Dr. Monica Miller, Associate Professor of Religion and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Lehigh University. She is also a member of the Executive Board of the American Humanist Association. I'd like to start with some opening remarks, and we will start with you, Ashton.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me on during this important event. The first thing I want to start with is to get people to understand that not only as a Black secular person, recognize the intersectionality of what it is to be Black, and I'm also a Black gay person living with HIV. I also happen to be an atheist. And so all of those things connect and impact how I navigate through my life, how people who look like me, other people of color, Black and brown folk navigate through their lives, especially under a Trump administration, and moreover under administrations on a local level that are very Trump-like. So as our discussion continues, the importance of voting does not just rest on the presidential election. It rests on every single local election where you are. Get the Trumps in your backyard out too.
Thank you. Dr. Miller?
Good afternoon. It's so good to be here with you all today, and to my fellow panelists and those tuning in. It's really an honor and a pleasure to participate in this much needed panel discussion today. I've been following along with the conversation since the start of the event, so it's been a real treat and pleasure. So deep thanks to Sarah Levin for the invitation, as well as to Secular Democrats of America and all other constituents who helped to make today's event possible. I'm going to briefly just sort of open up with some prepared remarks, and I'd like to begin with a few words from James Baldwin, who in 1962, in Letter from a Region in My Mind, he offers a frame for thinking about Christian nationalism and white supremacy when he writes, quote, "When the white man came to Africa, the white man had the Bible and the African had the land. But now it is the white man who is being reluctantly and bloodily separated from the land, and the African who is still attempting to digest or to vomit up the Bible. The struggle, therefore, that now begins in the world is extremely complex, involving the historical role of Christianity in the realm of power, that is politics, and in the realm of morals. In the realm of power, Christianity has operated with an unmitigated arrogance and cruelty, end quote. So for me, to think through the realities of these two really not so separate and distinct themes of Christian nationalism and white supremacy is to really think about, in the first instance, kind of emphasizing what exactly guides our focus and perspectives on social and political life. What do we actively promote in discourse, legislation, politics, and culture? In other words, as Baldwin does so well, it really forces us to think about if we all exist as a kind of we. So when seeking to reach across lines of difference, what ideologies are held up in the spirit of democratized unity as a means by which we do or do not form a certain kind of common bond or mutuality? Both of these ideologies, right, then mature and kind of crystallize at the site of what I want to emphasize as a process of differentiation over and against a religious or even a racialized other who is seen as unlike itself. It is this vile and dangerous distinction-making process that is really at the center of the history that we all share, right? And really nothing more. So in a way, I think we have to give specific attention to the ways in which historically, I mean, democracy didn't necessarily protect Black folk from white folk, right? And church-state separation, as kind of outlined right there in the First Amendment, the surveillance of Black religious organizations by law enforcement agencies has something to say, right? It's never really been afforded to Black folks kind of assembling together, right, or closely together to make meaning. So even as these two frames for our occasion together represent, right, clear and acute threats to America, what Baldwin really does so well is kind of disabuse us of our penchant for distinguishing ourselves from them or and us, or that behavior is white, right? Whether it is religious or whether it's secular. So it is here at that critical juncture which really calls us to not examine the histories of our world making, but also the manifold ways in which we continue the dangerous and what Baldwin would call tragic work of both nationalism and supremacy, and really wanting to think about those vectors across multiple lines of ideological, right? Here we can think of both the religious and non-religious and embodied, right, whiteness or white supremacy differences. So really this kind of shift, I think, encourages self-examination and introspection among those of us who either refuse to consider the treachery of our group or their group's history, such as Christianity, or maybe, you know, for other folk, find themselves kind of gloating in the supposed liberation of their group from the bondage of such duplicity, such as white, non-religious, or secular liberals.
Thank you. Dr. Jones?
Hi, thanks. So great and so honored to be here with everyone. And I want to thank Dr. Miller for evoking James Baldwin. I read a lot of Baldwin working on my book. I think he's exactly right. His insights, I think, are really kind of like X-ray vision, I think, for seeing through some of the kind of the beyond the surface of things, down to the deeper structures. So I think the first thing I want to say is, you know, the topic today is Christian nationalism, but historically, it's always been this melding of all at once. In fact, we have kind of an acronym that's fairly known. It's White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? WASP. This WASPy notion that to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and that's a claim of power, right? That has been here with us really since the beginning of the country. And I think what's often overlooked is that this marriage between white supremacy and Christian supremacy really has been with us, you know, in the not so recent past. I mean, you think of even a fairly progressive, who was thought of as a fairly progressive president, such as FDR, infamously said in 1942, you know, that this is a Protestant country and Jews and Catholics are here by sufferance. And what what went unsaid and didn't even need to be said because it was so dominant is that what he really meant there was that this is a white Protestant country, right? That is the privileged category. And so, what's I think marks a lot of our politics today, just kind of lay some groundwork, I think, is that the country has really shifted. I mean, it's never been true that the country, of course, is a white Protestant country. But until recently, you could demographically say that's true. But what's notable about the last decade of change in the country is that we have gone from being a country that even in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, for example, the country was 54% white, non-Hispanic, and Christian. But today that number is 44%. So we have crossed this threshold, even just demographically speaking, of being a country that could be described as a majority white Christian country, one that could no longer be majority white and Christian, and that diversity is really reflected across all kinds of places. And one place I'll say, just in closing, is that it's actually affected in those who claim no religious faith at all in the country. So as you all mostly know, it's that number today is about a quarter of Americans who claim no religious faith at all, and that group, in terms of race and ethnicity, is about as diverse as the country as a whole. I think maybe sometimes people think of the kind of atheist group as being mostly white, but in fact, it's only the group of religiously unaffiliated today is only about 6 in 10 white, and that's about the same level of, that is in the country as a whole. So there's a kind of racial ethnic diversity in that group as well. But I think the main topic on Christian nationalism here is, I think that I want to kind of just make sure we have, is that it really is white Christian nationalism that has been the thing making these exclusive claims to power, limiting access of other Americans to everything from jobs to neighborhoods to votes. That is the thing that I think we're still wrestling with, getting clear about and excising from our democratic society.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And we're going to stick with you for a second for this opening question. And I know you already touched on this, but I want to sort of define our terms here for our audience. What is Christian nationalism, or you would say white Christian nationalism? How does it relate to white supremacy? And how have the political manifestations of these ideologies impacted you personally?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, I'll go back to Baldwin here. I mean, I think one of the things he's so good about is kind of helping us think about things like whiteness and Christian in these terms. And, the American context provided a very unique place for a concept like whiteness to really gain hold. All right. And Baldwin's really clear. It's like, look, think about the immigration story of most white Protestants. They didn't arrive on these shores thinking of themselves as white. They arrived themselves thinking of themselves as British or German or French, right? And it's here in the U.S. context that umbrella category really takes off again as a way of demarcating a privileged class, in the country. And in Christian, I think also, despite the fact that we have religious freedom right there, right at the beginning, First Amendment to the Constitution, there's a way in which that up until this generation, it hasn't really been tested as well or in a full way. And that is that I think many white Christians, particularly in the country, could rely on the fact that just the sheer demographic and political power that they had would ensure that even paying lip service to something like freedom of religion wouldn't result in a lot of loss of power. But today, that's no longer true. And so I think the real question of whether we really mean it when we say, that this is a country built on religious pluralism and that's the heart of democracy here, that question is being put to us, I think, in a way that other generations haven't really had to face, because we are at a place finally where white Christians can't depend on kind of owning the table, even as they pay lip service to religious diversity. And I'll say, so just real quickly on the personal front, so I have new book out. It's just been out a couple of weeks now, called "White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity." And that book is a result of this journey and a kind of gradual awareness of someone like me who grew up in Mississippi as a white evangelical Protestant, of just how shot through my white Christian faith and the faith that I inherited from past generations, how shot through that faith was with assumptions of white supremacy. And, I think one of the big tasks before us today in this generation is to finally disentangle, a commitment to whiteness and white supremacy from a commitment to authentic faith, and also and to disentangle the kind of dominating claims of Christian supremacy, and finally be at a place where, white Christians are willing to take a place at the table along with the non-religious, along with Christians of color and indigenous religions, and everyone around the table where everyone has equal footing.
Thank you. Dr. Miller?
Yeah, that was great, Dr. Jones. Thank you so much. And you've really connected, Christian nationalism and white supremacy for us so importantly and poignantly. I think I'm going to jump right into the common denominator here that I think we really have to think about and give more specific thought to is whiteness, right? Which presumes its supremacy and ascendancy across many vectors of society, such as religion, science, philosophy, politics, right? To name only a few. And I think this is where, groups across religious divides and groups across various kinds of demographics can really think about, right, in terms of dominant culture folk. And I think we tend to over-animate as explicit, kind of overt and blatant acts of white violence and terror upon non-white people as, these strong efforts towards the continued illusion of domination and power among white people in all areas of social, political, economic, and religious life. So on one hand, we kind of hyper-exaggerate the explicit, and yet we often end up making kind of two mistakes in a way, in so much as we tend to separate out, right, whiteness from its religion of Christianity, and vice versa, as well as notions of supremacy from the everyday pernicious realities and forms of whiteness, right, so seen in and among those assumed to be free from the reins of theism and religious thought, and or political conservatism more generally. So in this sense, I think we must continue to identify and call out, right, the conscious and unconscious kinds of assumptions that Americanness is already so intertwined with Christianity, whiteness and nationalism, and whiteness, right, with a sacred type of domination, dominion, and power, that to begin to recognize and understand its political manifestations is to commit to identifying the work of how, right, whiteness has and continues to act as a god unto itself, whether that be realized in the form of a pan-Christian state or apprehended as the promulgation of, say, some sort of collective belief in a more secularized vision of white objectivity or detachment in the name of a scientific method or a, form of political governance.
Thank you. Ashton?
For me, speaking from, I guess, a street activist point of view, I spent a lot of time in the Texas legislature, so I can illustrate to you what Christian nationalism looks like, also known as white nationalism. It looks like taking your policies and making them reflect a religious ideology or belief and making them state law. That looks like attacking trans people. That looks like attacking women's right to choose. It means that they are saying that they have dominion over our personal autonomy and that they have power and control over our everyday aspects of life. And they're doing everything they can to keep hold to that power. And it's not just about voting. Reflecting on what Robert and Monica said, I thought about this long and hard before I decided to do this panel. And one of the reasons why is that not only do we have to address the issue of Christian white nationalism, we also have to address the issue of secular white nationalism. Because it seems as though we, not in this panel, but overall, we ignore the overarching white nationalism and how that white gaze, G-A-Z-E, permeates into every discussion that we have and every decision that we make when it comes to Black lives or BIPOC at large, where we have to navigate through these systems that we're talking about in this conversation, but without the actual tools. So the direction I want to go with my comment is we really need to put the seed there to talk about how we navigate through these systems of oppression while dismantling them, because we can no longer focus on the reforms and the science is given to us by white men rooted in white racism. We talk about science, well, let's talk about the science of our medical practice, where nurses are still going to school and getting a degree from books that teach them that Black people still have a higher pain threshold, which leads to a large amount of death while giving birth to Black women to their children, because no one knows how to truly measure the pain of a Black person, because we're supposed to be able to just handle anything they give us, right? And then think about the whole mental health care aspect of this. If we are to continue thinking about how we dismantle white Christian gaze and white supremacy and white nationalism, we also have to talk about how we have to redefine everything. We have to redefine what is medical, what is criminal. And so when we're talking about dismantling Christian white nationalism, the reality is that it's more than just taking prayers out of school. It's more than just, what Representative Raskin said earlier about how we approach as a nation on a diplomacy sense, in a diplomatic sense, how we work with other countries. The reality is if you're going to do that, Representative Raskin, and this is my final closing to the statement, is that if we're going to do that, we have to talk about what's happening right here at home, and how those people take the ideology from the United States and they go as missionaries and NGOs to places in Africa, to different nations in Africa, and build countries that are just as bad as we are, right? And there are a reflection of white men with Black leadership, Black or African leadership, and you see female circumcision, you see an LGBT people be murdered. You're having people leaving and fleeing countries because they're not getting what they need, all for the sake of a white man being able to take his little kids over to Africa and teach people the Bible in exchange for malaria medication and education. We have to look at how we do everything, including education, healthcare, and how we live in general. And that's where I'll leave it.
That's a great segue into the next question, which is, can we dismantle Christian nationalism and white supremacy at the same time, and how? And I'll start with you, Ashton.
So dismantling means recognizing the symptoms of the issue. We have to call things what they are. Every time Donald Trump opens his mouth, it took the media 3.5 years to say he's a racist, right? And not even that. As a person who votes Democrat and reluctantly, because the Republican Party doesn't align to me, the Libertarian Party is too white, the Green Party, all of those parties are too white and male, and so this is the closest thing I could align with. But the reality is dismantling Christian white nationalism is also looking within the Democratic Party and all of our institutions for that matter, and calling out the racism in each and pulling it out and letting people have a discussion about it and figure out where to go from there, right? We know we can't just have some kind of pseudo-quasi happy existence where it's called out and it happens. Last night, watching the opening of the DNC was the most triggering and gaslighting experience that I've had in my political life. And I've worked on many campaigns and even run for office. And when I tell you to watch Houston's Police Chief Art Acevedo on a panel talking about racial justice, with the man who is now the presumptive nominee, who I do not support but will have to vote for because I don't want a Trump in office, it's what calling out and dismantling white supremacy in the Christian nation looks like, or what they call a Christian nation looks like, because that's not the way this country was built. But also remember that capitalism and the country itself was built on the construct of race. And in context, that means that we have to look at the very foundations, even our Constitution, and tear out what isn't working. And there are people who are going to fight tooth and nail against that. We talk about defunding the police. That's another way to do it, right? Because people think, oh, it's our God-given right to regulate this, that, and the other, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Like, I don't have any intelligent words to say except for using street language right now. It's not working. What we're doing right now is not working. We have work to do to dismantle Christian white nationalism by getting those folks out of our local legislatures and out of our city councils and off of our county commissioners' courts and out of our judiciary system. Because we can get a Trump out and we can get a Biden in, but those Bible-toting bigots are going to do what they want to do anyway. And in many cases, some of those people are running in seats that are not term limited. So everything that we talk about is a form of a lifetime appointment, right? And so I hate being political, but that's the reality of it is. Black Lives Matter is political. Black Lives Matter is a phrase, right? And when we talk about Black Lives Mattering, we have to talk about the idea of viewing things through an internationalist lens and recognizing that not just in this country while we're forcing change, we actually have to look everywhere else, internationally speaking, and work with people. For example, Black folks exist in every inhabited continent on this earth. There have been movement. We saw global movements of protests for Black Lives Matter and other issues pop up all over the place every time something happens. The racism is not just here, but they are looking to us. They are looking to us. The gay Russian man who was murdered 2 years ago, who followed my blog, was looking to me to see how he can activate and how he can organize, and he organized. We have a responsibility, y'all. And the responsibility is to the people who feel like they don't have a voice, to be able to build space for them to have their voices heard and to get actual change. That's how we dismantle white Christian nationalism, by making them shut the hell up, get out of the way, and do right by people. And that is really what humanism is it not?
Thank you. Dr. Jones?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is obviously the question, right? How do we dismantle something that has been built over centuries of time, right? I mean, this is not a small feat or a small question. It's fairly daunting. I do think the current moment is one that provides an opportunity. I'll give you just kind of one thing that I finished the book last fall, turned it in, and at the time I would not have anticipated, for example, that I write in the book about the monuments and the Confederate monuments in Richmond. They have 5 major big monuments on Monument Avenue in Richmond. I would not have anticipated that just in a few weeks' time, 4 of those 5, the statues at the heart of those monuments have been removed. The 5th one is due to be removed. And then I think the foundations that have stood for hundreds of years are cracking. And I think that's due also to the demographic changes in the country. And Ashton, to your point about Texas, spent a little bit of time in Texas. I actually went to seminary in Texas, know a little bit about Texas, politics there. But one of the things that you would never know by visiting the Texas state legislature is how much the demographics of the state have changed, right? It still looks like a white Christian place when you were inside the legislature and looking at the elected officials. But our latest data from PRI shows, for example, in Texas, do you know what the biggest religious group in Texas is? It's the religiously unaffiliated. 21% of Texans are religiously unaffiliated. That's bigger than white evangelical Protestants in the state of Texas. White evangelical Protestants only make up 17% of Texans today. Now, again, I think it's a kind of jaw-dropping statistic. If you just walk through the halls and look at the folks representing Texans, it doesn't look like that. There's a lag effect between who our elected officials are and where the country has already moved. And so I think closing that gap is kind of part of the task, going forward. That's and one of the ways you do that is you vote, right? In the upcoming election. But the one other thing I'll say is seeing something like white supremacy and not dismissing it as some fringe thing that people in sheets do, and that has nothing to do with me, I think is one of the key things and one of the key challenges, particularly among whites and white Christians. And so I think just doing little things, like instead of kind of just thinking about the KKK in the 1920s, just taking the plain meanings of the word and flipping them around. What does it really mean? Well, it means to favor a society that's organized, to favor and value the lives of whites more than it values the lives of other people. I mean, that's really what white supremacy is at the end of the day. And I think that's one of the reasons why a phrase like Black Lives Matter resonates so well and gets to the heart of the matter, because it really is that. If you think about the country, preserving certain neighborhoods only for whites, for certain jobs only for whites, education, jobs, it's power, right? At the end of the day, and there's been a systemic attempt through most of the nation's history that again has been propped up and legitimized by Christianity, by white Christian churches, and it kind of put a divine stamp of approval on it. And so I think this moment is providing an unusual opportunity, I think, for reflection and to see this in a way that has remained invisible for many whites. And I, for one, have at least been encouraged by seeing the number of people who are not African American, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, but who think of themselves as white, who have shown up, in some of these marches. Now, it's certainly, we're not there yet, but I do think there's an opportunity here to see some things and to really have a reckoning with this past in ways that we haven't, perhaps, maybe even in my lifetime.
Thank you. Dr. Miller?
Yeah, so just to add on, I mean, obviously this is the $1 million question, right? But it's so complicated and it happened and continues to happen, right, over this long trajectory of time. So always cautious to sort of prescribe, antidotes, for example, right, that could achieve this in a one-time sort of way. But I imagine that this work would involve a certain kind of collective responsibility among just white people in general, right? Whether they be Christian, I think Ashton was hinting and gesturing towards this as well, whether they be Christian, secular, free thought, et cetera, right? To take stock of that history, their own unique history, right? And the many ways in which that's whiteness's identity-making process historically, right, and in today, it continues to assert a particularly pernicious form of supremacy, whether that be in the name of perpetuating, whiteness in and through functioning identity-based centers such as God and belief, which we can, see as represented in Christianity or for Christians, but also too, and Ashton pointed towards this as well, even in terms of how we sort of hyper exaggerate, that which is to be gleaned from, science, or how we kind of whitewash in a lot of ways, right? Rationality, right? For those who are identify as secular. So I think to begin this work, we need to really understand and also break down and confront the historical and contemporary problem of the making and the continuation of whitenesses that for white people more generally, this kind of God complex. And here I'm borrowing from white religion scholar Dr. Christopher Driscoll in his work, White Lies. But whiteness in itself is really wrapped up in the inability to accept human limitation, right? As such. In a way, right, cutting a vector straight through any of our religious and or secular kinds of divides. So this is always and really continues to occur as a kind of distinction-making method really over and against racialized others, such as Black and brown bodies. The identity-making process of whiteness itself, it cannot be, and nor should it be, disconnected or really seen apart from the terror and violence that has accompanied its making and really its fight for long-held domination. And so I think that, one piece of this is a recognition of that problematic and terroristic and fraught history. And on the other hand, it's also learning how to interrogate oneself, right? When one feels disconnected from that history or actually free from that history. So in this way, whether one sees oneself as tethered to a Christian identity or not, or despite how one understands or sees oneself as nationalistic or not, I think the larger work to be undertaken here is a work of archaeology or of cartography, right, of map making. And that is to think very carefully and very thoughtfully about locating and pinpointing and mining and assessing all that has gone into the making of this thing that we call whiteness, right? And whiteness's seemingly perpetual need to, whether it's across time and space and history, assert domination in and through both explicit but also implicit forms of racialized violence. So that is to say we have to consider those, Dr. Jones pointed this out, those wearing sheets, right? But also give attention to those less considered modes of systematic terror that, seem to at first glance seem arbitrary or kind of mundane, right? We talk about, again, I'll go back to that category. We talk about, Western objectivity or Western, forms of rationality, but that too in and of itself comes with its own problematic history. And we continue to perpetuate a particular kind of identity around what that looks like and what that means and where that can be found. So I think on both extremes we have here, and really that both of them have resulted in insurmountable racialized harm and death, right? Especially for Black and brown bodies the world over.
Thank you so much, all of you, for really fantastic answers to this really big question. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think you all had great answers that we can think about that are actionable. I want to now ask each of you a question specific to you and your work, and then we're going to have a closing question, and I'd love to get all of you to weigh in on. So first, I'm going to circle back to Ashton. Can you share your working in racial justice, your experience working in racial justice as a Black atheist, as a Black humanist, and share in what ways do you find yourself battling white Christian supremacy in your work with Black Lives Matter in Houston?
I don't even know where to start with that one. Honestly, you know, for me as an atheist, let me preface by saying it's never been about the abolishment of religion. I don't care what you choose to believe in or what you choose not to believe in, as long as you're not taking your deity or your belief and using it to harm other people. With that said, I've always taken umbrage and offense organizing within community, because people always did this and we had to break out of it, and luckily we don't do it anymore. Break out of organizing in churches without the understanding the historical aspects of it. You know, like if this was 1965, you're right, I would be in a church organizing. I organize in churches now. That's not a big deal. But there are some people who feel like there's some symbolic gesture, and they take that and it permeates into activism in other ways, where people stand around in prayer circles when they could be getting work done. I'm not talking about the grandma prayer circle where they're like doing, you know, wishing you well and that kind of thing. I mean, doing it just to be seen. I'm wary of people who want to fight for justice or claim to fight for justice, and all you see is them a picture in a newspaper in a prayer circle. That's not what I need. I need for the victims and the family members of the victims of police brutality and systemic racism, whether it be related to police or not, to be the thing that's being addressed. Today, DeAndre Arnold and Caden Coleman, who were going to school in Barbers Hill ISD, won their case. And I don't know if y'all remember that, but that was the case where the young boys had dreadlocks here in Texas, and Gabrielle Union invited DeAndre out to the Oscars for that. And what we saw from that is that even within the Black community, even within the brown community, the internalization of Christian white gaze in the white nationalist sense is something that we have to talk about unearning as well. So in my experience as a secular activist, it's been an all-around fight. When we talk about intersectionality in the context of Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, or even bringing in Bayard Rustin or even Baldwin, we know the history looking back, when some of those people who identified as LGBT are not necessarily looked upon in a faithful light, or in a favorable light, I should say, as trustworthy, because we happen to identify as LGBT like I do. And I've had to battle that as well from all sides. So when we're talking about my activism in particular, I've had to learn how not to allow that to stop me from doing the work that I do. Because for every naysayer out there who sits in some form of privilege, there are tens of people, thousands of people who are literally just trying to survive every day, who need help. And that's what my main focus has been. So personally, I just kind of drove into the work of making sure that I'm doing work with the Christians who do want to do the work with me, who are accessible, and making myself accessible to people who want to get something done that will have the most maximum impact towards increasing quality of life, period. That's my biggest and only concern as an activist. And so when people always ask me in panels as a member of Black Lives Matter Houston, they'll ask, well, who are you telling Black Lives Matter to? Or like, do you need, like, they ask me this in the context of, are you asking permission to say this? No, I'm not. And I alluded to this earlier about people needing to have dominion over others and personal autonomy questions or issues. I'm not saying Black Lives Matter for white people to say it. I'm saying it for Black people to know that Black Lives Matter. We don't need permission of white folks or people who are white adjacent, you know, like Clarence Thomas, Kanye West, Herman Cain, who recently passed away, Candace Owens. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the everyday people who are now working in drive-thrus at or below minimum wage and are being called essential workers. Our medical technicians, our nurses, the people who are out there doing everyday work, driving our buses. What do you need, right? Because we're telling people we're scared of sending our children to school, because I'm against sending children to school during the pandemic. But what are we doing to provide Wi-Fi access and technologies to people who are victims of the digital divide, especially in rural areas? As a person living with HIV, for example, I've been called nasty, all kinds of things, because people don't understand or have the level of sex positivity that other people have, and also know that HIV is not always contracted through sex, right? Those types of things where you see the intellectual laziness start to kick in. And that's what we see a lot with Christian white nationalism, is intellectual laziness, where they don't read up, they don't go and seek the information about the facts of how things actually work and how and where things land. It's always been about their assumptions, what pastor taught them or what mama and them told them, and so on and so forth. And that has made it really hard for me as an activist working in certain circles to help people unlearn and relearn certain things on the most basic level. And I learned as a student of sociology, I guess I'll close by saying this, that there are three versions of English you have to speak to people. And this is not like an old code switching, but a lot of the language that we're using today, everyday people on the street are going to look at you and say, what? What is that? And so in my activism, I've had to learn how to not dumb down, not tone down, but speak in a language that's everyday understandable, and connect the dots to how those people will be affected to what I'm speaking a concern about. And so that's what my activism has been so far. And that's honestly why we've been more successful in a lot of the things we do at Black Lives Matter Houston, because I'm surrounded by people who are the same way as me with their own individual aspects, of course, being able to go in, do what needs to be done, and then get the hell out. There's no need to linger, and there's no need to just like dwell, but know that we can no longer just fix things. We have to rebuild things. And that's where my mind is right now, I guess, as I close, is how do we dismantle foundations built out of clay feet, as the biblical folk would say, and build something that has a strong foundation going forward for the next 200 years, because this year is a culmination of 200, 300, 400 years of white supremacy and how it's been festering. And there's no stitch or Band-Aid or antiseptic that can fix it except for us doing what we need to do.
Thank you for that. And thank you for your activism on the ground. I know it's hard. It's likely, it feels like an uphill battle over there in Texas, but we really appreciate your work. Dr. Miller, 1 in 3 millennials are religiously unaffiliated, but the Black community continues to be among the most religious constituencies. The American Atheist Secular Survey released this year showed that Black participants were half as likely to have supportive parents and 3 times as likely to be physically assaulted for their non-religious beliefs. What should we understand about Black non-religious youth, and how can we engage them as a party and as a secular community in a way that meets them at the intersection of their racial and non-religious identities?
Thank you for this question, Sarah. So it's a really important one. The first thing I'd say is that while surveys and other kinds of social scientific increase into the religious and non-religious within the U.S., they've no doubt, and we've heard it throughout today's conversation so far, right, that they've no doubt provided vital data that really continues, I think, to inform us, right? We can think about them as a political demographic. We can think about them as a certain kind of racialized demographic, as being of a particular age, right? So there's all this way, there are all these ways in which it continues to provide vital data in that regard, and really helps us to really helping us to inform our understanding of changing conceptions of belief and non-belief, or ideas of God and world, right? Or patterns and practices of ritual and tradition, even, political life and participation among those demographics or among millennials. But I'd also simply caution here that social scientific, data or social science that really looks into the religious salience among Black youth and Black people, in a way kind of says little, this is just my opinion, about their beliefs in a theological or metaphysical sense. I think it actually says more about the ways in which civic and social, political, and even economic life and possibilities were either limited to institutions of religion in a historical sense, or in a changing conceptions of community or in belonging in an America that is still today so hostile to Black life. Ashton gestured towards this when he mentioned that, if he's got to go into church and do organizing, go into church and, do organizing, that's not a part of the larger concern. I think the reality of the tragic findings of the American Atheist Secular Survey, as it concerns Black participants, it really points to the large and often forced role that white Christianity, I think, has played in the lives of Black people historically, and also the inherited durability and fortitude of what we call Black religion, right? So often presumed to be kind of theistic in nature. I think what we need to understand about Black youth is that they, like generations before, they continue to challenge the racial protraction of American life, right? Through a variety of, or through a multiplicity of remixed modes and practices, such as hip hop, for example, even with its own problematics, right? We could look at hip hop culture as an example here. So hip hop, right, which for the untrained ear, I say untrained for those that are not used to listening, it can sometimes sound too religious in a rhetorical sense, say for secular folk, right? Or too secular in a way for religious folks. So in other words, I think talk of religion in hip hop, or religious themes, for example, in hip hop, or Black culture writ large, it often points to something much more strategic, something much more humanizing, and in my opinion, something that's much more secular than previously assumed. So to me, this is really the brilliance and genius of Black culture more generally, right? The ability to speak in multiple tongues, in layered kinds of ways, to really get at something much larger, or signify on the barest realities of life and self-help and re-education. And humanization, right? I've called this in some of my prior work as a certain kind of outlaw humanism, despite the religious secular kind of divide that's really endemic to Black life, a kind of secular religiosity or religious secularism through the prism of the body of Blackness that really demands new ways of listening and hearing and relating and defining. I think that's going to be really hard, but it's a must for white people across religious and or non-religious divides. So in this way, Black youth culture, Black culture more generally, really asks us to think and to rethink in a much more complex, I think in ways that are much more demanding, ways that will and does really challenge whiteness's historic and continued reliance on the presumed easy distinctions that I talked about earlier, including our own trust, or dare we say faith, in statistical data.
Thank you. And Dr. Jones, this one's for you. And actually, as much as we want to see your face, tech support advised me for you to turn off your camera to see if the audio might be a little bit better. We'll see if that works.
All right.
Okay, and here's the question. One might hope that there is an opportunity for Americans across the religious and non-religious spectrum to have a conversation like this one and work together to dismantle white Christian nationalism in favor of a pluralistic vision of religious freedom. You've just published a book on the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity, and you have a trove of nonpartisan polling data to draw on at the Public Religion Research Institute. How possible do you think this is in our current moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a real challenge, I think. One place I think it is happening, though, more than perhaps other places, is inside of Democratic Party politics. And one of the reasons I say that, I don't say that as from a partisan perspective, but one of the challenges of the political polarization we have today is that it is absolutely driven by race and religion. So the Republican Party today, for example, is 7 and 10, made up of 7 and 10 white Christians. The Democratic Party is only about a third white and Christian, and has nearly as many religiously unaffiliated people in its ranks. So if you think about the kind of movements in society, one of the ways of thinking about it is within political parties. The conversation that is by necessity happening inside the Democratic Party is very different than the conversation that by necessity has to happen inside the Republican Party, which is a very homogeneous setting. So when Democrats are talking about a policy or a candidate, then by necessity, there's no one group that makes up a majority inside the Democratic Party. And so I think this by design has really made it a necessity to have a more pluralistic way of talking, to think about not making a lot of assumptions in the kinds of cases that you're putting forth, being respectful of other perspectives at the table. I think we'll see a very different sense, particularly toward religious and racial pluralism in the country, a very different image this week than we'll see next week. So I think there's some sense in which sort of the internal debates and tensions, and there's certainly no sense that either political party as these great big monoliths are comfortable or all of one mind, but the kinds of give and take and compromise and debates that have to happen, I think, inside the Democratic Party, by their very design, have to acknowledge, right, that this very large group of people who claim no religion, at the same time, there's other groups that do. So I think there's some openness there, but I also think that we're seeing, even in our public life, it's worth kind of noting the other way. I think we've moved away from this a bit with the present administration, but it's worth noting that George W. Bush was actually the first president to name in a speech, when he was talking about, he used the phrase churches, synagogues, mosques, and people who follow no religion in the speech, as he was describing the American religious landscape and giving a nod, right, to this diversity in the country. So I don't want to kind of think there's one party kind of holding this together, but I do think in the current context, we're not hearing a lot of that rhetoric from the current administration for sure. But I think going forward, any party that wants to really be a national party is going to have to acknowledge the religious and racial diversity in the country in a very robust way, or to its detriment, really, as a competitive force in national politics.
Thank you. And I think you kind of addressed my next question, Dr. Jones. So just let me know, because it is a partisan one, if you want to weigh in or if I should move on. The closing question is, for the Democrats watching, what would you like their biggest takeaway to be as they think about these issues, both in the context of these elections, but also as we envision what a Biden-Harris administration will look like? Dr. Jones, would you like to weigh in on that?
I think as a head of a nonpartisan organization, I'll take a pass on that.
That's totally fine. We understand that. Ashton, go ahead.
So what I'm looking for, and I noticed you might have picked up on my criticism earlier about the opening of the DNC. What I'm hoping for is that we don't make the mistake that we did under the 8 years of Barack Obama, who, for all intents and purposes, did a great job. I didn't agree with his immigration policies, but his door was open. The unfortunate thing about his door being open is that it wasn't open until midway through his second term, when all of his gatekeepers left and all of the people who were donors and had money that was swirling around him and his administration, keeping grassroots activists and people like Dr. Miller and Dr. Jones out of space. I'm hoping that a Biden-Harris administration will be open from day one, so that we can get work done, not just for from the ideological sense, but to make sure that we are in the room when certain things as it pertains to women's rights, racial justice, LGBT rights, we need to see that more to the forefront. You can't just be for something. You can't just show up to a protest. You can't just make videos saying Black Lives Matter. You actually have to show us through your action. And your actions right now, even as candidates, are not looking good, locally or nationally. Start talking to the people who will be voting for you. Or put it another way, don't be like Beto O'Rourke or John Ossoff. Don't ignore talking to Black people and lose out on 200,000 votes and let a Ted Cruz or a Karen Handel get in a seat. Okay? So with that, the other thing that I want to leave with you is that we should be listening to people. I said I'm going to vote, but I bet you my inbox is going to be full when this video is over with. But why don't you like Biden? I said I was voting for Biden and Harris. I reserve the right as a voter to criticize said candidates. I also have the right to mute your ass. Excuse my French. The point that I'm trying to make is that instead of punishing people for where they stand, listen to them and find out what the issue is. Find out what the distrust is. Because I'm telling you now, nationally, from what I've seen in the activist circles, people are not happy. People will be voting, but don't push us too hard. Listen to us and ask us what we're looking for. We're not coming with frivolous requests. We're not making frivolous demands. We're people who have been on the ground for 5 or 6 years working in these offices and doing the work to get bills passed. Even here in the Texas legislature, by my count, I've helped to write 5 bills that have been signed by a Republican governor. So my point that I'm trying to make to you is be willing to work with people you disagree with. Be willing to listen and be willing to do what needs to be done for the greater good, because if you don't, we're going to be stuck. And not just with another Trump administration, but stuck in the reality that no one wants to recognize that there were people around saying when Michelle Obama said, I want the America that Michelle Obama spoke of. I've never seen that America, ever. I've seen glimpses of it. I've seen pieces of it. But the same day that same-sex marriage got legalized, 9 people got killed in the Carolinas in a church. The same day I was at the Supreme Court to hear General Bergefell v. Hodges, Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore. I can be Black and get married. I can be Black and run for president, but I can still be murdered by a cop or a disgruntled white neighbor or off-duty cop or a politician who refuses to do what needs to be done to stop a pandemic. This is some serious stuff I'm talking about. Think critically, don't be lazy.
Thank you, Ashton. And Dr. Miller, will you close us out?
Actually, I think Ashton really, is working on the ground and as an activist, as well as those, other areas that Ashton works in. I think that, Ashton, you really, really powerfully summed up what it is that a Biden-Harris, administration needs to do. And then also, I think for Democrats, as a group, right, as a kind of politicized sort of reality, what it is that we or they need to do, right? And I think that you really hit the nail on the head. And this was such an honor to think with and share space with both you and with Dr. Jones. So again, thanks to you both. And thank you again, Sarah, for this opportunity.
Thank you all for participating. Ashton, Dr. Miller, Dr. Jones, we appreciate your scholarship, we appreciate your activism, and appreciate your coming together to have this conversation. And so we have reached the end of the program. Thank you all for joining us today. This is a truly historic moment for the secular community. I want to close with a call to action. Please join and support the Secular Democrats of America. If you are a Democrat in Texas or Nebraska, visit our website at seculardems.org to connect with them. If you're a secular Democrat in Florida, as we speak, there is an election of leadership for the up and coming Florida Secular Caucus. Please follow Secular Democrats of America on Facebook, on Twitter at Secular Dems, and be sure to sign up to join us on the website. And you can also donate whatever you can give, whether it's $1 or $100. Every dollar will empower our activists on the ground and grow this movement. That's seculardems.org/donate. Thank you again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the convention.
Take care.
We got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle. Of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling down. I've heard about your hero, Joshua, but his accomplishments are not so great, because there's none like Thomas Jefferson and the wall between church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling down. Some say that the wall between church and state is just a bad metaphor. But if unbelievers can't be protected from the rest, then what is the Bill of Rights for? We got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling down. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come a-tumbling down. Oh, we got to fight the battle of church and state, church and state, church and state. We got to fight the battle of church and state, or the wall will come